In this world, a broken sword is thrown into the dump like trash. No one hears that it hasn't finished speaking yet. Caden picks up a shard of the blade caked with dried blood, and the shard answers him. For 10 seconds, his hand knows how to kill. The most useless skill in the world has just become the most dangerous. But let's go back a minute. The first thing he feels is pain, sharp pain. It's as if someone is driving a rusty nail into the back of his head and twisting it. His face is pressed against cold metal. His mouth is filled with dust and a taste of blood. He opens his eyes and sees a gray sky, low, alien, not his sky. He realizes this immediately, just as he realizes that the hands bracing against the ground are too thin, too young. He sits up. His head feels like it's exploding from the inside. 2 streams of memory crash into him at once. In one, he's taking apart an 18th century clock mechanism in a workshop on the 3rd floor. In the other, he's rummaging through a pile of rusty scrap metal outside the city walls to sell it for a penny. Both streams are real. Both are his. And that's impossible. He squints and presses his temples. His palms are dirty, calloused, with broken nails. Not his palms. His palms. Caden Orwell, 19 years old. His mother died in childbirth. His father never returned from the war. 6 years at the junkyard outside the city walls. Skill, scavenger. F rank. Rock bottom. The wastelands stretch out in every direction. Mountains of scrap metal, shattered swords, cracked shields, rusty arrowheads. All of this was once a weapon. It was magic. It was power. Now it's junk. And the boy who lived in this body was part of that junk. For 6 years he'd rummaged here from dawn till dusk, looking for a piece intact enough that a weaponsmith would give him a couple of coins for it. More often than not, he found nothing. Sometimes he went without food for 2 days. A shard lies beneath his right palm, half a blade. The hilt is broken off right at the guard. Brown streaks run along the groove. Old blood. Caden knows this steel. No, Daniel knows it. Roughly forged, a bluish tint. Some kind of impurity he's never encountered before. But his hands remember what matters most. A broken thing is not a dead thing. It's a thing that hasn't finished speaking. He picks up the shard, and the shard answers. Not with a sound, not with an image, with a sensation. A surge of sharpness races from his fingertips to his elbow. For a split second, his right hand becomes someone else's. A hand that knows how to cut, how to slip between the plates of armor, how to twist the blade so the wound doesn't close. 10 seconds, then it fades. His heart is pounding in his ears. It's not his imagination. It's magic, alive, in a shard that any appraiser would have tossed aside without a second glance. He runs his finger along the jagged edge, carefully, like a crack in a violin, and a second wave washes over him. An image, blurry like half-developed film. A field, many bodies, rain. A man on his knees holds this sword, still intact. He's looking at someone in front of him. His lips are moving. Caden can't hear the words. He only feels bitterness, weariness, and something like a farewell. The image fades. The shard lies on his lap, warm as if it were alive. Now understand where he woke up. A restorer. In a world where every old thing is magic, where broken artifacts are thrown into the dump because no one knows how to hear what's left inside them. Where the forges of rebirth reforge ancient blades into new ones and lose 80% of their power. Where his skill is considered is the most useless. Last on the list. He almost laughs. A dry wheeze escapes his throat. He gives himself 3 days to figure out this body, this skill, this world. To find food and water and a place to sleep without risking getting stabbed for a couple of copper coins. And then he'll start working, because there's one thing he knows for sure. For 20 years, Daniel Orwell repaired things that everyone else considered beyond repair. Watches with broken balance wheels, violins with cracks running across the soundboard, porcelain shattered into 40 pieces. He didn't repair them for profit, but because every broken thing is a person who hasn't finished their story. And now he has a whole world of such things, a whole world of untold stories. He stands up. His legs are shaking. His body is weak and hungry. In his jacket pocket is a single copper coin, enough for a piece of bread if he's lucky. He tucks the shard into his belt, carefully, as if it were a treasure, because that's exactly what it is. The first in his new collection. The city begins behind a stone wall half a mile to the south. Low towers, smoke rising from chimneys, large enough to hold merchants, shops, and the appraisers' guild. Caden walks toward the gate, and on the way, he sifts through someone else's memory. His mother's name was Elin. She used to sing lullabies, not to him, to other children. He knows her voice only from what others have told him. His father left for the border when the boy was 13. He never returned. He simply ceased to exist, like an object left in the wrong place. Then there was his aunt. Then a fever that took her too. Then 4 years alone at the dump. At the gate, a young guard. He looks at Caden without interest. A skinny kid from the wasteland. A dirty jacket. There are hundreds like him here. Caden walks past. Beyond the gate lies the artisan street. Blacksmith shops. The smell of red-hot metal and oil. The clang of hammers. Daniel inside him notes that the blacksmith in the nearest forge is striking unevenly. His left hand is weaker than his right. The tempering will come out defective. A professional habit, even after death. He finds a bakery on the corner. The smell of hot bread hits him so strongly that his vision blurs. He buys half a gray flatbread. That's all he can afford. He sits down on a stone step and eats slowly. His body wants to swallow it all at once. He doesn't let it. 20 years of restoration have taught him one thing: haste kills. A man in a leather apron walks by. A knife hangs from his belt. The hilt glows greenish. An artifact. Weak. Maybe D rank. But alive. It's worth more than what Caden earns in a year. This world runs on magic. Magic lives in objects. Objects decide everything. A top-rank sword turns an ordinary soldier into an army. A staff allows a single mage to level a fortress. All of this once belonged to someone. All of this was a living conversation between the craftsman and the owner. And now the blacksmiths grind the old into the new. They erase the memory. They get an obedient tool. They lose 4/5 of their power. And nobody cares, because nobody hears what's being lost. But he hears it. Caden finishes his flatbread. He stands up. He has no money, no place to stay, no weapon except a shard tucked into his belt, no name that means anything. But he has hands that know how to repair things. And a whole world of broken things. This is the beginning. On the second day, Caden returned to the wastelands. Not because he wanted to, because he had nowhere else to go. He spent the night by the wall of a grain warehouse on the outskirts of town. A cold, long night. His body ached in places Daniel hadn't known existed before. His ribs, his lower back, his finger joints. This body was worn out like a tool that had been misused. 19 years old, but it felt like 40. He got up before dawn, stretched his arms, headed for the south gate. It was a different guard. He didn't pay any attention either. In the wastelands, he worked methodically. Not like before. Not like the little boy Caden who simply walked around and grabbed whatever he could find. The Daniel inside him had built a system. First, he marked out a section, 10 steps by 10. He crouched down, placed both palms on the ground, closed his eyes. The scavenger's skill responded with a faint tingling in his fingertips when something lay beneath something with residual magic. Before, the boy Caden would simply follow that tingling sensation and dig, without thinking, without analyzing. Daniel did things differently. He walked the entire square, slowly, step by step. He memorized where the tingling was stronger, where it was weaker, where it wasn't there at all. An hour later, he had a map, not on paper, in his head. 14 points, 3 strong, 6 moderate, 5 weak. He started with the strong ones. The first turned out to be 2 elbows deep. He had to dig with his hands. There were no other tools. The soil of the wastelands was hard, tamped down over the years, mixed with debris and rust. Dirt mixed with metal dust caked under his fingernails. Caden dug, thinking about how, in his previous life, his worst work problem had been glue that wouldn't set in damp weather. He dug down to the object, pulled it out, brushed it off. A spearhead, wide, blade-like, a single stiffening rib down the center. The steel had darkened with age, but hadn't rusted through. Now that was interesting. Ordinary steel in the wastelands would rust within a couple of years. This one had held up. So there was more to it than met the eye. He placed the spearhead in the palm of his hand. He closed his fingers around it. He waited. The echo came a few seconds later. A blow. Sharp. Piercing. It felt as if his arm had grown 2 meters longer, and at the very end of that length was a point of absolute concentration. The spear knew how to pierce. Armor, a shield, a wall. It didn't matter what. One movement, one point, right through. Then a memory came, a brief one too. A man, not young, tired eyes, standing on the wall of some fortress, an army below, a spear in his hands. He knows he won't live to see morning. He isn't afraid. He's just tired. The image faded. Caden put the spearhead in his bag. Carefully. He wrapped it in a rag. A second strong signal led him to a fragment of a shield. A third of a round shield. The wooden base had rotted away. Only the metal facing and the umbo remained. There was an engraving on the umbo. It had worn away almost completely. Caden held it up to his eyes. Daniel inside him squinted. Lines, curves, not an ornament. Letters, a name. He made out 2 of the 6 symbols. Some were missing. But the residual magic in the shield was pure, warm, without bitterness, without pain. The person who had held this shield had not died in anger. Caden put the fragment in his bag. The third signal turned out to be deeper, almost 4 cubits. Caden dug for a long time. His hands were tired, his back was burning, but he kept digging, because the signal was unusual, not just warm, vibrating, as if something down there was quivering in response to his touch. He reached the object and stopped. It was a buckle, small, bronze, from a belt or a bag, completely intact, not a scratch, not a speck of rust, as if it had been placed here yesterday. Caden took it in his hands and froze. The echo was different. Not a blow, not a stance, not a fighting move. Warmth. Simple physical warmth, as if someone had embraced him. The buckle didn't remember a fight. The buckle remembered the hands that fastened the belt every morning. It remembered the warmth of a body. It remembered the routine. It remembered home. Caden sat on the edge of the pit, holding the buckle in his palms. The warmth wouldn't fade. Steady, calm, without pain, without bitterness, a pure fragment. Perfect. Not for battle, for something else. He set the buckle aside from the rest of his finds, into the inner pocket of his jacket, closer to his body. By noon, he had 11 items, 3 valuable ones, 4 of moderate value, 4 that were only good for selling to a junk dealer. He returned to the city. At the city gate, he sat down on a rock and laid out his finds. He took the 4 worthless items to the junk dealer on Craftsman Street. The old man with yellow fingers from smoking tobacco looked at the pile of rusty iron. He weighed it in his palm. He grimaced. He offered 12 kopecks. Kaiden didn't haggle, not because he didn't know how, but because he didn't need to draw attention to himself just yet. 12 kopecks was enough for 2 flatbreads, or 1 flatbread and a night's stay at the flophouse by the port. He chose the latter. The flophouse was exactly what he'd expected. A filthy hall, 20 straw mattresses on the floor, the smell of sweat and sour beer. The old man at the entrance took 4 copper coins and pointed to a corner. Kaiden lay down. He placed the bag with his finds under his head. He closed his eyes and began to think. He needed a plan, not a grand one, not for a year ahead, just for a week. First, money. The junk dealer pays a copper coin per pound of scrap metal. That's a dead end. He needed another buyer. Someone who understood the difference between worthless scrap and scrap that still had value left in it. Second, information. He knew this world through the memories of an orphaned boy. Those were memories from the bottom of the barrel. He knew where to sleep so he wouldn't get robbed, where to eat so he wouldn't get poisoned, where to dig so he wouldn't fall into a hole. But he didn't know how the system worked. He didn't know how the guilds operated, how ranks were assigned, how skills were registered, how artifacts were sold. He needed access to this knowledge. Third, safety. Kaiden's body was weak. He didn't know how to fight. He didn't know how to run. He didn't even really know how to stay on his feet for more than a few hours without his knees starting to shake. One blow and he'd be down. He needed protection, or at least a way to avoid situations where protection was needed. He ran through the options until he fell asleep. The morning of the 3rd day began with rain, light, cold. Kaiden stepped out of the flophouse and turned his face toward the raindrops. His body shivered instinctively from the cold. He paid no attention to it. Today he wouldn't go to the wastelands. Today he'd go into town. Gunsmith Street in Hallgren stretched from the south gate to the central square. 18 shops. Kaiden walked past each one. He didn't go inside. He looked. He memorized. He assessed. Daniel inside him worked like a scanner. The sign was cracked. That meant business wasn't going very well. The display window was full. That meant the merchandise wasn't selling. The shopkeeper stands at the entrance, beckoning customers. That means the competition is fierce. He was looking for a specific kind of shop. Not the wealthiest, not the poorest. One where the owner is experienced enough to tell quality apart, and greedy enough to try to cheat a customer. He found it on the 14th Street. The shop had a simple name, Swords and Shields. No surname on the sign, no coat of arms. The display case was average, 3 swords, 1 shield, 2 daggers. Everything gleamed. Gleamed too much. Daniel snorted to himself inside. Reforged, cheap, polished for show. The classic scheme. You pick up an old artifact for pennies in the wastelands. You reforge it. You lose almost all its power, but the blade looks brand new. You add a fake engraving. You make up a story. You sell it for 100 times the price. Kaiden stepped inside. Behind the counter stood a man of about 45, broad-shouldered, a blacksmith's hands, his face red from the heat of the forge, cunning eyes. He looked down at Kaiden. Skinny, dirty. The wastelands. Not a customer, He was about to kick him out. But just then the door opened again and another man walked in. Tall, a cloak of fine cloth, gloves, soft leather boots, a belt with a silver buckle. A nobleman. Or a wealthy merchant. The armorer instantly forgot about Caden. He turned to the customer, smiled, broadly, falsely. Caden retreated to a corner. He watched. The customer was looking at the swords in the display case. The armorer began to speak. "This blade here, a knight's sword. It saw action at the Battle of Culloden 3 centuries ago. Grade B. Verified by the Appraisers Guild. Reforged by master craftsmen, retaining 80% of its original strength. Price, 120 gold pieces." The customer raised an eyebrow. He picked up the sword, turned it over in his hands. He was hesitant. Caden stood in the corner and listened. Daniel inside him had already passed judgment. The tempering is uneven. The guard is crooked. The balance is shifted toward the blade. This isn't B rank. It isn't even D rank. It's a reforged piece of cheap scrap with a fake engraving. A good master would have spotted it right away. But the buyer wasn't a master. He was a man with money and a desire to hang a beautiful sword on his wall, and the swordsmith knew it. Caden understood that he shouldn't interfere. It was someone else's business, someone else's money, someone else's problems. A smart person would have walked away quietly. Caden didn't walk away. Later, he would think about that moment and try to understand why. Maybe because Daniel had spent 20 years watching people being sold fakes and had kept quiet because it wasn't his business. Maybe because, as a 6-year-old boy, Caden had kept quiet because he had no say in the matter. Maybe because the shard of the sword at his belt was still warm and served as a reminder that things deserve the truth. He stepped out of the corner. He politely asked permission to look at the blade. His voice was quiet, calm. The armorer flinched. He wanted to snap at him, but the customer looked at Caden with curiosity and nodded. Caden took the sword. He placed his palm on the blade's surface. He closed his eyes. The echo came immediately, faint, pitiful. Agony in the steel. A rabid dog. A baker with trembling hands. A discarded knife. Not a sword, a knife. Reforged into a sword. 8 years ago, the Tyrant settlement. Caden opened his eyes. He looked at the customer. He calmly said that this blade had never been in the Battle of Culloden, that it had been forged 8 years ago in the Tyrant settlement, that its first owner had been a baker, that he had slain a rabid dog and thrown it away that the steel still smelled of flour, and that it wasn't worth buying. Silence. The customer slowly placed the sword on the counter. He looked at the armorer. The armorer turned crimson. The customer turned and walked out, without a word. The door closed. The armorer leaned over the counter and grabbed Caden by the collar. He lifted him up. Caden's feet left the floor. The armorer's face was pressed against Caden's, red, frantic. He said he'd kill Caden, that he'd break both his arms, that he'd throw him out into the wasteland and bury him in the same pit he'd crawled out of. Caden hung in his grip and thought that wasn't the best plan. Definitely not the best. And at that moment, the shop door opened for the 3rd time. A woman walked in, short, red hair tied back in a bun, round glasses on her nose, gloves, a notebook under her arm, an emblem on her cloak, scales, and a magnifying glass. The Appraisers Guild. She stood in the doorway and looked at both of them. First at the armorer, who was holding the skinny guy by the chest, then at Caden, who was hanging in mid-air with a completely calm expression, then at the sword on the counter. She said she'd been standing behind the door for the last 3 minutes, and that she'd heard every word. The armorer let go of Caden, not out of kindness, out of fear. The Appraisers Guild emblem on the woman's cloak had the effect of a bucket of ice water. He stepped back behind the counter. He lowered his hands. His face was still red, but his eyes were already weighing his options. Caden landed on his feet. He straightened his jacket, silently. The woman stepped inside. She closed the door behind her. She walked up to the counter. She picked up the sword. She turned it over in her hands. She put it back. She took out a notebook. She opened it to a blank page. She wrote something down. The armorer began to speak, hastily, rambling, that this was a misunderstanding, that the boy from the wasteland was talking nonsense, that the sword was genuine, that the paperwork was in order. The woman raised her hand. He fell silent. She said she would conduct an official inspection of the blade at the guild's premises, that if the sword turned out to be genuine, she would apologize. If not, the armorer would have a week to close his shop and remove himself from the registry. The armorer turned pale. The woman put away her notebook. She turned to Caden. She looked at him over her glasses. Her eyes were gray, attentive, assessing, definitely assessing, as if she were looking at an object that needed to be classified. She asked his name. He said, Caden Orwell. She asked his skill. He said, Scavenger, F rank. She wrote it down. She didn't seem surprised. She didn't smirk. She just wrote it down. Then she asked if he could repeat what he'd done with another object. He said he could. She nodded, said she wanted to see it, right now. They left the shop. The gunsmith remained standing behind the counter, white as a sheet. The rain had stopped. The street was wet and glistening. The woman walked quickly. Caden could barely keep up on his long, weak legs. She introduced herself as they walked. Evie Cassell, junior appraiser, 3rd class, Halgren branch. He noticed she hadn't mentioned her family. She didn't mention her family, just her title. The Appraisers Guild building in Halgren was a 2-story stone structure with narrow windows, not large, provincial. Evie led him through a side entrance, not the main one. Caden took note of that. She didn't want her colleagues to see that she'd brought a boy from the wasteland. They went down to the basement, a long hallway, numbered doors. Evie unlocked one of them with a key. A small room, a table, 2 chairs, shelves along the walls crammed with boxes. The archive. She sat down at the table. She motioned for Caden to take the second chair. She pulled a box out of a desk drawer. She opened it. Inside lay 3 items. A fragment of a dagger with a wrapped hilt. A fist-sized stone set in a silver mount. A scrap of chainmail consisting of 15 links. She placed them in front of him. She said these were items from the current inventory. She knew the rank and origin of each one. She wanted him to touch them and tell her what he felt. Caden looked at the items. Daniel, inside him, quietly noted that this was a test, a careful one, a professional one. She wasn't showing him anything valuable, just items from the current routine inventory. If he made a mistake, nothing terrible would happen. If he guessed, it would be interesting. He picked up the dagger first, placed it in his palm, closed his fingers around it. The echo came quickly. Cold. Night. A narrow street. A man in a hood. A blow from bottom to top. Short. Well practiced. The dagger knew how to kill quietly, quickly, without unnecessary movements. And the dagger also remembered fear. Not the victims, the killers. The man in the hood was afraid. He was afraid every time. And every time he struck. Caden opened his eyes. He said the dagger belonged to a mercenary, a professional assassin, but a reluctant one. The man didn't kill because he wanted to, because he couldn't stop himself. Caden estimated the weapon's age, about 100 years. He said there was a trace of silver in the steel, that it wasn't a combat dagger, it was a tool for a specific task, and that the residual magic in it was dirty, heavy, like the smell of rot. Evie didn't move. She just watched. Then she slowly wrote something down in her notebook. Caden picked up the stone in its setting. This one was different. Warm, soft, smooth, like the light through a window in the evening. The stone remembered a woman, a young woman. She wore it around her neck. It rested against her collarbone and felt her heartbeat. She was happy. Not always, but when she wore the stone, she was happy. Because the stone was a gift from someone she loved. Caden said this out loud. He said the stone had been part of a pendant, that a woman had worn it, that the emotional imprint was strong and clear, that it was about 200 years old, that it contained healing magic, weak, perhaps enough for mild pain relief, but stable. Evie took notes. Her hand was trembling slightly. Caden noticed. He picked up the chainmail and immediately put it back, abruptly, as if he'd burned himself. Because he had burned himself. The chainmail was screaming, not with sound, with sensation, pain, rage, horror. 15 rings, and within them was so much foreign suffering that Caden felt sick to his stomach. He stepped back from the table, clenched his jaw, waited. Daniel inside him noted that this was the first truly tainted fragment he'd ever held in his hands. The wastelands were kinder. Things lay there for a long time. Time smoothed out the sharpest edges. This chainmail had been recovered recently. The pain hadn't had time to cool. He told Evie he wouldn't touch this item again. He said there was death in it. Not just one, several. That the owner had been on someone's side in something very bad. That the chainmail remembered the smell of a burning village and a child's scream. That the item's rank was probably C, but he would recommend disposal. Reforging would purge the magic, but not the memories. Whoever later wore an item made from these rings would have nightmares. Silence. Evie sat motionless. Her notebook lay open. Her pen froze mid-word. She looked at Caden, not as an object, for the first time not as an object, as a person she couldn't classify. She closed the notebook. She put the items back in the box, slowly, carefully. She said that all 3 descriptions matched the guild's records. A mercenary's dagger from the era of the Silver Wars, Countess Till's pendant, a fragment of chainmail from the excavations at the Silent Ravine, the site of a battle where 3 centuries ago a peaceful community was destroyed. Everything matched. She said that the scavenger skill was described in a single line in the guild registry, the ability to detect the presence of residual magic through tactile contact, rank F, minimal practical value. What Caden was doing wasn't described anywhere. Reading an object's history, detecting an emotional imprint, assessing magical purity, determining age and origin. This wasn't rank F. It was something for which there was no name in the registry. Caden remained silent. He wondered whether he should tell her everything. About Daniel, about the transfer, about the fact that he wasn't the Caden everyone thought he was. He decided not to. Not now. Maybe never. Instead, he said he had a proposal. He'd show her what he could do. She'd give him access to information, to books, to catalogs, about how the world of the vessels works from the inside. Not as a scavenger from the wasteland knows it, but as a guild appraiser knows it. Evie took off her glasses. She wiped them with the edge of her sleeve. She put them back on. She looked at him. She asked where he spent the night. He told the truth. Nowhere in particular. Last night at the Flophouse. The night before that, by the wall of a warehouse. She was silent for a moment. Then she said that in the archive basement there was a small storeroom for seasonal documents. There was a cot there, because she herself sometimes stayed there until late at night. Caden could sleep there, temporarily, until they figured out what to do with him. He nodded. She stood up, walked to the door, turned around at the threshold, said she needed to go upstairs and check some documents, that she'd be back in an hour, and that if he was hungry, there was a tin of cookies on the shelf behind the third box on the left. She left. Caden sat in the archive room, alone, in silence, under a roof for the first time in 3 days. He found the tin of cookies, opened it, ate 3 oatmeal cookies with raisins. Then he lay down on the cot. The ceiling was low, made of stone. Boxes of documents lined the shelves. It smelled of paper and dust and just a hint of milk from the teapot on the bottom shelf. He closed his eyes. The shard of a sword at his belt was warm. So was the buckle in his inner pocket. 2 little voices telling him he wasn't alone. Daniel inside him said quietly, "Okay, we have a roof over our heads. We have cookies. We have the first person who doesn't look at us like we're trash. That's already more than we had yesterday." He fell asleep. Evi's first week in the cubbyhole passed in silence and among papers. Caden read. Evi brought him boxes from the archives, one after another. Vessel catalogs, artifact registries sorted by rank, skill descriptions from F to A, evaluation protocols, reference guides on metals and alloys, historical reports on major battles with lists of lost relics. Daniel inside him soaked it all up like a sponge. 20 years of working with antiques had taught him one thing. Before you fix something, you need to understand the system, how the market works, who buys, who sells, where the money is, where the power lies. Where are the loopholes you can squeeze through? Adram's system was simple. At the top sat the royal houses with their collections of S-rank relics. Below them was the aristocracy with their A and B rank vessels. Next came the Adventurers Guild, which hunted for artifacts in ruins and dungeons. Even lower were the Forges of Rebirth, which processed the loot. At the very bottom were the merchants, buyers, and junk dealers. And in the trash beneath them were the scavengers. The Forges of the Renaissance were the key link. They controlled the reprocessing. Every artifact recovered by the Adventurers Guild passed through them. An ancient S-rank sword, reforged, 80% of its power lost. The result, an A-rank sword, pure, controllable, expensive. 4/5 of the original magic dissipated into the air, lost, forever. And the whole world considered this normal. Caden read the reforging logs and his teeth gritted. It was like watching a restorer repair a Stradivarius by replacing its soundboard with plywood. It works, it sounds good, but what made it great was gone forever. On the 4th day, he asked Evie if there was a catalog of lost artifacts, the ones that had broken or been discarded. She looked at him over her glasses. She said there were no such catalogs. Broken artifacts aren't cataloged. They're written off and sent to the wastelands, or to the forges for raw materials. Caden was silent for a moment. Then he said it was as if a library were throwing away all the books with torn covers. Evie didn't get the comparison. He didn't bother to explain. During the day, Caden went to the wastelands. His system had become more precise. Every day he marked off a new square. He dug, he excavated, he assessed them, he sorted them. He sold the weak fragments to a junk dealer. He stored the average ones in the storeroom. He studied the strong ones separately. In the evenings, he sat on the cot with his latest find in his hands and listened. The spearhead told him about the wall and the army below. The buckle was silent and warm. The shield fragment gave him a sense of someone else's stance, heavy, confident, the stance of a man accustomed to withstanding blows. Caden began to notice a pattern. The fragments weren't random. Each carried within it one specific thing, one skill, one feeling, one memory. And some of them resonated in the same key, like the notes of a single melody. The spearhead and the shield fragment, strike and stance, attack and defense. Two fragments from different people of different eras. But the technique was compatible. Caden tried it. Carefully. He took the spearhead in his right hand. He pressed the shield fragment against his left forearm. He activated both at the same time. For 3 seconds, his body moved not as Caden's body. His right hand knew the strike. His left hand knew how to parry the counter. For 3 seconds, he was a soldier. Then the fragments faded, and he fell to his knees, breathing heavily. His head was spinning, a taste of copper in his mouth. But it worked. 2 fragments. 2 shards from a trash heap. 3 seconds of someone else's skill. He lay down on the cot and stared at the ceiling. Daniel inside him was counting. If 2 fragments give 3 seconds, what would 5 give? 10? 20? And what would happen if all 20 were pure, without dirt, without pain, without someone else's guilt and someone else's fear? He was thinking about this when the door to the small room opened. Evie walked in with a teapot and 2 cups. She sat down on the edge of the table. She poured tea with milk. She handed it to him. Caden took it. Hot. Sweet. The first hot drink he'd ever had in this world. He drank and said nothing. Evie was silent too. Then she said she'd filed a report about the sword from the armorer's shop. An official inspection confirmed it was a fake. The armorer had been given a week to close up shop. Caden nodded. She said she hadn't mentioned his name in the report. Caden looked at her. She explained. If Gildia found out that some F-rank scavenger had identified a fake that a certified appraiser had missed, it would raise questions. Unpleasant questions. For her. Because she was a junior appraiser with no connections. An upstart, in her colleague's opinion. If she drew attention to herself in the wrong way, her career would be over. Caden understood. She was helping him, putting herself at risk. Quietly. Carefully. Hiding from her own superiors. He asked why. Evie finished her tea. She set down her cup. She said that at the Appraisers Guild, they'd taught her one rule. An item's value is determined not by its origin, but by its properties. It doesn't matter how it ended up in your possession. What matters is what it can do. She looked him straight in the eye. She said she didn't yet know what his actual rank was, but she knew it wasn't an F, and that she intended to document it, properly, by all standards, so that when the time came, no one could say it wasn't true. Caden was silent. He was thinking about how this red-headed girl in round glasses had just described her life. She too had been considered trash, an impoverished family, no connections. She'd made it through on her own merits, not through connections. And every day she proved she had a right to be here. She valued other people's treasures, but no one valued her. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a bronze buckle. That very one. Clean. Warm. He placed it on the table in front of her. He said he'd found it in the wastelands. That it contained no combat magic. Only warmth. Memories of home. Of the hands that fastened the belt every morning. He said that such things had no rank in the guild's system, but to him, they were the most valuable, because they were pure. Evie looked at the buckle, then at him, then back at the buckle. She reached out. She touched it. Of course, she didn't feel anything. She didn't have the skill, but she held the buckle between her fingers for a long time. Then she quietly put it back. She said thank you. She stood up. She picked up the teapot. She left. The door closed. Caden sat in silence. The buckle lay on the table, glowing faintly. No, it wasn't glowing. It was just the bronze catching the candlelight. Just bronze. He put it back in his pocket. On the 5th day, he made a decision. He needed a workshop. Not a room in the guild's basement. His own. With a workbench. With tools. with a door he could close so he could work. The problem was money. He had 32 copper coins. Rent for the cheapest room in the craftsman's quarter cost 5 silver coins a month. 1 silver coin was equal to 100 copper coins. He was catastrophically short. He needed to earn money, real money, not a copper coin for a pound of rusty iron. Something that would show the world what a scavenger's skill was worth. On the 6th day, he found the answer. In the wastelands. In a pile of scrap metal near the northern border. A fragment of a hilt. Wooden, wrapped in leather, split in half, without a blade. Daniel, inside his mind, raised an eyebrow. Wood. Not metal, a rarity in the wastelands. Usually wood rotted away over the years. This hadn't rotted. The leather was cracked, but still held. So the hilt had its own vessel, its own magic, separate from the blade. He picked up the fragment. A strange echo came. Not a strike, not a stance. Balance. The hilt remembered the grip. It remembered how the palm rested on the leather. It remembered how the fingers distributed the pressure. It remembered the perfect balance between strength and control. A master swordsmith had wielded this sword. Not a soldier, not a mercenary, a master. A man who understood the sword as an extension of his arm, and the hilt had absorbed that knowledge. Caden sat over the shard for an hour, listening, learning. The hilt told him things not written in any textbook. How to stand, how to breathe, how to distribute his weight. This wasn't combat technique. It was a philosophy of handling a weapon, the foundation upon which everything else is built. He put the hilt in his bag. He stood up. He looked north. The wasteland stretched to the horizon, an endless field of debris, millions of shards, millions of stories, millions of voices that no one listens to. He turned around and walked back into the city. He had an idea. The idea was simple. The gunsmith with the fake sword wasn't the only one in town. Daniel had worked for 20 years in a world where half the antique shops dealt in fakes. He knew what a fake looked like. He knew what the real thing looked like. And he knew that people were willing to pay for the difference between the two. On the 7th day, he left the guild early in the morning. He walked down Gunsmith Street. He didn't go into any of the shops. He counted them. 18 shops. Of those, based on outward appearances, at least 5 were selling reforged weapons with inflated grades. Another 3 were questionable. But gunsmith shops weren't the only market. In Halgren, there were jewelry workshops. There were antique shops. There were private collectors. There were nobles with family heirlooms who wanted to know the true history of their heirlooms. There was a demand. Not for a junk dealer, for an appraiser, an independent one, an incorruptible one, someone who could lay a hand on an item and tell the truth. The problem was that independent appraisal was a monopoly of the guild. Only a certified appraiser had the right to issue an official report. But Caden wasn't certified. He was an F-rank scavenger. His word had no legal weight. He needed another way. And he found that way at Hallgren Market Square. Once a week, on the morning of the 4th day, an open market took place in the square. Merchants laid out their wares. Buyers wandered among the rows. Small artifacts were bought and sold, D and C rank items, and sometimes B rank. Blacksmiths brought in fresh reforged items. Adventurers sold loot from dungeons. Small-scale craftsmen offered repairs and sharpening services. Caden came to the square neither to buy nor to sell. He came to listen. He walked between the rows. He stopped. He watched. When a merchant offered a buyer a sword, a ring, or an amulet, Caden would stand nearby and listen to the conversation. The merchant would praise the item. The buyer would express doubts. The merchant would recount the history and its specifications. The buyer would examine the item. Neither of them knew the truth. The merchant repeated what he'd been told at the forge. The buyer would believe it or not. A game of blind faith. Caden waited for the right moment. He found it at the ring counter. An elderly merchant was selling a silver ring with a red stone. He called it a ring of fiery protection. B rank, 20 gold pieces. A female customer, a woman in her 30s, dressed simply but well. The wife of a merchant or a craftsman, not poor, but not rich either. 20 gold pieces was apparently a significant sum for her. She wanted a ring for protection, maybe for her husband, maybe for her son. She was unsure. Caden approached. He politely asked permission to take a look. The woman was surprised. The merchant frowned, but Caden had already reached out his hand. The merchant flinched. Caden quickly said he wasn't going to drop or steal anything, that he simply wanted to help the customer make the right choice. The shopkeeper opened his mouth to object. The woman said he could take a look. Caden took the ring. He placed it in his palm. He closed his eyes. A faint echo came through. Very faint. The stone was almost empty. Fire protection. Yes, it had once been there, but after reforging, no more than 5% remained. The ring could slightly warm a finger in the cold. That was all. No protection. No B rank. D at best. He opened his eyes, looked at the woman, quietly told her that the ring wasn't worth 20 gold pieces, that there was almost no magic left in it, that it wouldn't protect anyone from anything except a slight chill, that if she needed real protection, she'd better look elsewhere. The woman turned pale. She looked at the merchant. The merchant turned crimson. He started shouting, "Fraud! Thief! A scavenger from the wasteland is sticking his nose where it doesn't belong!" People began to gather around. Caden stood calmly. He waited. When the merchant ran out of breath, Caden said one sentence. He said that if the merchant was confident in his merchandise, he should take the ring to the Appraisers Guild for an official inspection, at his own expense, right now. Silence. The merchant was silent. Everyone around him was silent. An official inspection by the guild cost 2 silver pieces. Not expensive, but if the result didn't match the merchant's claim, the merchant faced a fine, a hefty one, and the loss of his license. The merchant remained silent. The woman put the ring back on the counter. She left. The crowd began to disperse. Caden left too, but not far. He walked over to the next row. He stopped at a counter displaying old weapons and waited. 10 minutes later, a woman approached him. It was that same customer. She asked how he knew about the ring. Caden said he could hear things, that it was his skill. She asked how much he charged for such an inspection. Caden wasn't prepared for that question, but Daniel was. 2 copper coins per item, he said. The woman nodded. She took 3 items out of her pocket, a brooch, a bracelet, and a pendant. She said her husband was planning to buy one of them for their daughter. She needed to know what was worth the money and what wasn't. Caden picked up the brooch, silver with a turquoise stone. The echo was soft, pure, protection against colds, weak but genuine, stable, an honest piece, worth the money. He told her that. He picked up the bracelet, copper with embedded shards. The echo was jagged, torn, a patchwork of different fragments, poor workmanship. The shards weren't compatible with each other. They conflict. The magic cancels itself out. A useless thing, he said. He picked up the pendant, a silver chain with a small crystal. The echo was quiet, very quiet, but deep. Like a voice from a distant room. The pendant remembered something. Not for battle, not for defense. Warmth, light, someone's laughter. The magic within it was unusual, not utilitarian, more emotional. Caden held the pendant a little longer. The pendant told him. A woman had made it. A master jeweler. For her daughter. She had imbued the crystal not with a spell, but with a memory. A warm summer day, a child's first steps, laughter. It wasn't a combat relic. It was a gift. Caden opened his eyes. He told the customer that the pendant had no combat value, that no appraiser would give it a rank higher than F, but that it held a mother's memory of her daughter, and that if her daughter ever wore this pendant, and if she has even a shred of sensitivity, she'll feel warmth, not magical, human. The woman looked silently at the pendant, then at Caden. Then she took all 3 items. She placed 6 copper coins in front of him, and 2 more on top. She said thank you. She left. Caden stood in the market square, holding 8 copper coins in his hand. 8 copper coins. Not for a pound of rusty iron, for the fact that he could hear. For the truth. By the end of the day, 4 more people had approached him. The rumor spread across the square like the smell of smoke. A guy from the wasteland, a scavenger. He lays his hand on an object and tells the truth. 2 copper coins apiece, cheaper than the guild, faster, and more accurate if that woman with the ring was to be believed. 4 people, 11 items, 22 copper coins, plus 8 from the first client, 30 in a single day, more than he used to earn in a week in the wasteland. When the square began to empty, Caden was about to leave, and he saw a man standing at the edge of the square, watching him. A man. His age was hard to tell, maybe 30, maybe 40, dressed simply but well, a leather apron over his shirt. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a craftsman. His face was calm, his eyes were piercing. A hammer hung from his belt, not a battle hammer, but a blacksmith's hammer. A small brand mark on his apron, a circle and an anvil, the symbol of the Forge of Rebirth. The man looked at Caden. Caden looked at the man. They didn't say a word to each other. The man turned and walked away. Caden stood there, feeling a chill run down his spine. The Forge knew. It already knew. He returned to the little room late. Evie was there. She was sitting at the table with a notebook. She looked up when he entered. She looked at his face. She asked what had happened. He told her about the square, about the customers, about the money, about the man with the Kuznia brand. Evie took off her glasses, set them on the table, rubbed the bridge of her nose, said he was an idiot, said that doing that in an open square in plain sight of everyone was the stupidest thing she could imagine, said that the Kuznia Forge in Hallgren belonged to the Vaughn, that the Vaughn family controls 40% of the reforging in the entire province, that they don't tolerate competition, that they especially don't tolerate it when someone questions the quality of their products, and that an F-rank scavenger who publicly exposes reforging in the market square isn't just a problem for them, it's an insult. Caden sat down on the cot, in silence. He knew she was right. He knew he'd been careless. But 30 copper coins were in his pocket. 30 copper coins earned honestly, for a skill everyone considered useless. And that was more important than caution. He told Evie he'd be more careful. She said being more careful wasn't enough, that he needed status, any status, even a temporary apprentice appraiser's license, even a formal cover. Without status, he was just a poor kid from the wasteland who got in the way of serious people making money, and serious people would crush him. Caden asked how to get status. Evie answered, an exam, twice a year, the next one in 4 months. The admission fee is 10 silver pieces. At his current income, he'll save up enough in 3 months. Maybe. If he doesn't eat. Caden lay down on the cot. 4 months. 10 silver pieces. 1,000 copper coins. An exam he can't afford to fail. and the forge, which already knows his face. Daniel inside him quietly said, "So we'll have to work faster." He closed his eyes. The buckle in his pocket was warm. The shard of a sword at his belt hummed softly. They were both saying the same thing. Don't stop. For the next 3 weeks, Caden lived by a schedule that left him not a single free minute. Mornings in the wastelands, afternoons in the square, evenings in the little room with the books. His body was getting used to it, slowly. His legs stopped shaking by the end of the 2nd week. His hands grew stronger from digging. His back still ached, but it was bearable now. He ate twice a day, a flatbread in the morning, soup in the evening. He saved every copper coin. By the end of the 3rd week, he had 142 kopecks. 1,000 was as far away as the moon. But he didn't stop. People in the square already knew him, not by name, by nickname. Ragman, the scavenger who feels things out and tells the truth. Some came out of curiosity, others out of distrust. Still others came because they'd heard from a neighbor who'd heard from a godmother that a guy from Pustosia had saved her from buying a dud for 20 gold pieces. Caden worked quietly. He didn't hawk his wares. He didn't advertise himself. He stood at the edge of the square with a canvas bag and waited. People approached him on their own. 2 copper coins per item. Honestly, quickly, accurately. He never lied. If an item was good, he'd say it was good. If it was bad, he'd say it was bad. If he couldn't tell, he'd say he couldn't. The latter happened rarely, but it did happen. Some items remained silent, not because they were empty, because they didn't want to speak. Caden didn't pressure them. Daniel had taught him that a long time ago. An object would speak when it was ready, not before. In the 4th week, what he had both been waiting for and feared at the same time happened. An old woman came to him, small, hunchbacked, wearing a black headscarf. Her hands were gnarled from work. She took something wrapped in a rag out of her apron pocket. She unwrapped it. A brooch. Silver, with an enamel inlay. A blue flower on a white background. The enamel was cracked in 2. One half of the flower had chipped off and was lost. The clasp was broken. The silver had tarnished. The old woman said it was her husband's brooch. He had worn it on his lapel every day for 30 years. He died last winter. The brooch fell when they were carrying him. It broke. The old woman wanted to know if there was anything left of him in it. Caden took the brooch, gently, the way you hold a newborn. He placed it in the palm of his hand. He closed his fingers around it. The echo came softly, like a warm breeze. A man, not young, large hands. He smells of wood and varnish. A carpenter. Every morning he took this brooch from the shelf by his bed. Every morning he pinned it to his lapel. Every morning he looked at the blue flower and thought of the woman who had given it to him. 30 years of the same motion, 30 years of the same thought. She gave this to me. That means she needs me. That means this day is worth living. Caden opened his eyes. His throat tightened. He swallowed. He looked at the old woman. He told her that her husband thought of her every morning, every single one, 30 years. That the brooch remembers his hands and his thoughts, the same ones, every day. The old woman stood motionless. Her face didn't move. Only her fingers tightened around the edge of her apron. She asked if it could be fixed. Caden looked at the brooch. Daniel inside him had already assessed the damage. The enamel was cracked, but the base was intact. The silver had darkened with age, not from damage. The clasp was broken at the solder joint. It was a simple job. In his past life, he would have fixed it in an hour. In this life, he had no tools. He had no workshop, no solder, no enamel, and no polishing paste. But he had a skill everyone considered useless. He told the old woman he'd try, that he needed some time, a week, maybe 2. She nodded, left the brooch, left. Caden stood in the square, holding the broken brooch in his hands, and he knew this was the moment that would change everything. Not money, not status, not a career. This. A broken thing. A person who wants to hear the voice of the one they've lost, and he stands between them. A bridge, a restorer, the one who brings back what everyone thought was lost. That evening, in his tiny room, he placed the brooch on the table and stared at it for a long time. Then he took all his finds from the wasteland out of his bag. He laid them out. A spearhead, a shard of a shield, a buckle, a hilt. Shards, scraps, pieces, none of them fit. He needed a different fragment, warm, pure, with a memory similar to the one the brooch held. A memory of home, of love, of a habit that lasts for years. Only such a fragment could help restore what had broken in the brooch, because repairing metal is one thing, repairing a memory is another. The next morning he went out to the wasteland with a new goal, not to collect everything in sight, to search for something specific, a pure, warm echo. Without pain, without blood, without war. He dug for 3 days. He sifted through hundreds of shards. Most were dead, empty, eroded by time down to the last spark. Some were dirty. War, death, fear. He set them aside without touching them for more than a second. On the 3rd day of his search, in the northeastern corner of the wasteland, he found it. A small object, a button, made of tin, with an embossed design, a flower, like a daisy. The echo was perfect. A woman used to sew this button onto her husband's shirt. Every time the shirt tore, she would patch it up and sew the button back on in a new spot. She didn't throw it away. She didn't replace it. This one, this very one, because her daughter had given it to her as a gift for the Harvest Festival when she was 5. The button remembered the thread and the fingers and the quiet song the woman sang as she worked. Caden sat on the ground, holding the button. Tears streamed down his face, not from the dirty echo, from the pure one. The pure one struck harder, because there was no need to defend himself against it. He brought the button into the storage room. He placed it next to the brooch. 2 objects, his husband's brooch, his wife's button. Different people, different lives, but the same music. Habit, loyalty, a quiet love that doesn't shout, but simply does the same thing every day for 30 years. He began to work, without tools, with his hands, with skill. He placed the button in his palm, activated the reading, drew the echo out, slowly, carefully, like pulling a thread from a tangled ball of yarn. Warmth flowed through his fingers. He moved his hand to the brooch, pressed the button against the broken spot, and let go. The warmth passed through, not completely, just a drop. But that drop was enough. The crack in the enamel didn't disappear. The silver didn't shine. The clasp didn't mend. But the brooch trembled. Caden felt it, as if something inside it had turned and looked at him. His husband's echo grew louder, clearer. The mourning movement of his hand toward his lapel, a thought of his wife, a warm breeze. And for the first time in all the time Caden had held that brooch, he heard a voice. Not words, a sound, a man's, deep. 3 seconds, as if someone had sighed and said a name. One name. Mirren. Caden let go of the brooch. His hands were shaking. His head was buzzing. A taste of copper in his mouth. The button in his palm went dark. It had given everything it had. It became a lifeless piece of tin. But the brooch was alive, not repaired, alive. 3 days later, in the square, he gave the brooch to an old woman. He told her he hadn't been able to repair the metal, but he'd been able to restore the voice. He asked her to take the brooch in her hands and hold it. The old woman took it. She clasped it between her fingers. And a second later, her face changed. Her lips twitched. Her eyes widened. She heard it. For 3 seconds. Her name in his voice. She stood in the square, pressing the brooch to her chest, silently. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stood there. Then she slowly put the brooch back in her apron pocket. She looked at Caden. She didn't say anything. She walked away. Caden watched her go. Evie was standing nearby. She had come to the square to check on him. She saw everything. She held her notebook pressed to her chest. Her glasses were fogged up. She took them off, wiped them, put them back on. She said quietly that it was impossible, that what he had done wasn't described in any reference book, that the transfer of an emotional imprint between unrelated objects was… She didn't finish. She couldn't find the words. Caden said he hadn't transferred the imprint. He'd simply allowed the brooch to hear a similar voice, like a tuning fork. One vibration awakened another. The brooch remembered her husband. It just needed to be reminded of what that memory sounded like. The button, with its similar frequency, served as a trigger. Evie opened her notebook. She began to write, quickly, in small handwriting. She filled 3 pages. Then she closed it. She looked at Caden. She said she needed to have a serious talk with him, that evening, in the storage room. Caden nodded. That evening, Evie came in with a teapot and a folder, a thick one. She said she'd done some research. She'd pulled up all the guild's records on the scavenger skill for the past 200 years. 37 practitioners, all F rank, all paupers. All of them ended their lives in the wastelands or in workhouses. Not a single one had demonstrated anything resembling what Caden does. Neither reading history nor emotional imprints, let alone transference. All 37 used the skill in exactly the same way. They found items with residual magic. They sold them to dealers. That was it. Caden asked why. Evie said she'd been thinking about it. It was her theory. The scavenger skill has hidden levels, just like other skills. A swordsman's skill starts with a basic strike and develops into masterful techniques. A mage's skill starts with a spark and grows into elemental storms. The scavenger skill must grow as well. But in 200 years, not a single user has progressed beyond the first level. Because to grow, it's not enough to simply touch objects. You have to understand them. You need to know how the object is constructed, what it's made of, how it works, what's broken inside it, and why. You need the experience of a master, the experience of a restorer. Caden was silent. He couldn't tell her about Daniel. He couldn't explain how a 19-year-old orphan from the wasteland could have 20 years of experience working with antiques. Instead, he said he had a knack for it. Evie looked at him for a long time. She said that good hands wasn't an explanation, but that she wouldn't press him, that everyone has things they're not ready to reveal. She understood that. She was like that herself. They drank tea in silence. Then Evie left. A week later, the old woman sent a sack of flour. No note, no name, just a sack of flour by the door of the storeroom. Rumors began to spread. A month passed, then a second. Caden counted down the days until his exam and saved up money. 412 copper coins by the middle of the second month, half the amount he needed. He could have saved faster if he'd charged more for his work, but 2 copper coins per item had become his going rate. That was his signature. People came to him not because he was cheap, but because he was honest. He'd never made a mistake, he'd never lied, and he'd never turned away anyone who came to him with genuine pain. He didn't take a thing from the old woman with the brooch. She'd sent the sack of flour herself. In the 6th week, out in the wastelands, he found a bow, or rather, what was left of the bow, charred wood. The bowstring had burned down to a single hair. The leather wrapping was charred. The bow was dead. Any craftsman would have said there was nothing left of it. Caden placed his hand on it and pulled it away. Not because of pain, because of a scream. The bow was screaming, not like the chainmail from the guild, not out of rage, out of grief. The bow remembered the fire, the house that burned, the people who fled, the arrows that flew into the backs of those running, and the girl. Dark hair, a braid, a scar on her eyebrow that wasn't there yet. The girl had held this bow, the last thing left of the clan. She carried it through the forest, through the night, through the snow. She carried it and never let it go. 7 years. Caden sat on the ground, breathing heavily. He was shaking. The echo was both muddled and clear at the same time. The pain of loss. But beneath the pain lay loyalty. The girl had kept the bow not because she hoped to shoot it, because to abandon it meant abandoning them all. He wrapped the bow in a rag, carefully, the way one wraps a wounded person. He carried it into the storeroom, set it on the workbench. No, he didn't have a workbench. He placed it on the table. He sat over it for an hour, thinking. The bow had belonged to someone specific, someone alive. Someone in this city, or in this world, had carried that bow with them for 7 years, and then lost it or abandoned it in the wastelands. No. They didn't abandon it. The bow remembered that final moment. The hands that had opened. Not of her own free will. Someone had snatched the bow from the girl's hands, or she'd fallen and dropped it. And the bow had ended up here, at the dump, amid the trash. Caden closed his eyes. He knew he had to find that girl, who wasn't a girl anymore. 7 years had passed since the fire. She'd been 13 then. Now she's 20. Dark hair and a braid, a scar on her eyebrow. A hunter from the northern clan. He began his search, not in the wastelands, in the city. Hallgren was a trading hub. Caravans from the north passed through it. Hunters from the northern clans sometimes came down here to sell pelts and game. Caden went from tavern to tavern, from market to market, to the warehouses by the harbor. He asked around, quietly, cautiously. A girl from the north, dark hair, a scar on her eyebrow, a hunter. On the 3rd day of his search, he got an answer. The bouncer at the Crooked Horseshoe Tavern, a burly man with a broken nose, said he knew someone like that. Quiet, strange. She comes once a week, buys some jerky and leaves. She lives somewhere outside the city, doesn't talk. Caden asked when she usually came. The bouncer said tomorrow, if he was lucky. Caden arrived at the tavern at dawn the next day. He sat in a corner, ordered some water, waited. She walked in after noon, dark hair pulled back into a tight braid, a scar across her left eyebrow, white, old. She was wearing hunting clothes, leather with a fur lining. Her movements were quiet, economical, not a single unnecessary gesture. She approached the counter, placed some coins down, picked up a bundle of meat, turned toward the exit. Caden stood up. He said her name, Ha-Rin's son. She froze. She turned to face him. Her eyes were dark, cold, wary. Her hand moved toward her belt, where a knife hung. Caden raised his hands, palms forward. He showed he was unarmed. He said he wasn't an enemy, that he'd found something that belonged to her, that he wanted to return it. She stared at him without blinking. He took the bundle out of his bag, unwrapped it, placed the charred bow on the table between them. Ha-Rin stopped breathing. Caden saw it. Her chest froze, her eyes widened, her hand fell from her belt. She stared at the bow, at the charred wood, at the remnants of the bowstring, at the blackened leather wrapping. Her expression didn't change. Not a single muscle twitched. but she stopped breathing. Then she inhaled, abruptly, like after a long dive. She asked where he'd found it. Her voice was steady, quiet, like a knife on glass. Caden said in the wastelands, in the northeast sector. She was silent. He was silent. The tavern went about its business around them. Someone was laughing. Someone was clinking a mug. Ha-Rin stood there, staring at the bow. Then she said it wasn't her bow, that her bow had burned, that it was dead. Caden said the bow wasn't dead, that there was a voice inside it, that the bow remembered. She said she didn't need it to remember. She turned away. She walked toward the door. Caden didn't stop her, didn't call out to her. Silently, he wrapped the bow back up, put it in his bag, left the tavern. He knew she'd come back, not because he wanted to believe it, but because he'd seen her eyes the moment she laid eyes on the bow. She wasn't looking at a lifeless object. She was looking at the grave she'd spent 7 years trying to forget. 3 days later she came, not to the tavern, to the little room. Caden didn't know how she'd found him. He didn't ask. She stood in the doorway, silent, hands at her sides, her face set in stone. She said 2 words. "Show me." Caden took out the bow, placed it on the table. He said that for a complete reading, prolonged contact was needed, that he would hold the bow and tell her what he heard, that she could stop him at any moment. She nodded. Caden placed both palms on the charred wood. He closed his eyes. The bow revealed itself to him slowly, layer by layer. First, the fire. Flames and screams. Caden recounted it aloud, quietly, evenly, like telling a story to a child before bedtime. Ha-Rin stood motionless. Then the bow revealed more. Before the fire, practice. A girl and a boy, her younger brother. They were shooting at targets in the backyard. The boy was laughing. The girl was angry because he was laughing. Then she laughed too. The bow remembered those days, warm, clear, full of life. Caden was telling the story. Ha-Rin didn't move. Then the bow took her even deeper, the final layer. The boy, her younger brother. He's 12. He's sitting on the porch holding that bow, cleaning it. He rubs wax on the bowstring. He talks to it. The way you talk to a friend. He says his sister is the best archer in the clan, that he's proud of her, that when he grows up, he'll be just like her. The boy's last thought before the bow went up in flames. He was thinking about his sister. He wanted her to live. Caden fell silent. He opened his eyes. Ha-Rin was standing by the wall. She slid down it to the floor. She sat on the stone floor of the small room and stared into space. Her face was wet. She didn't make a sound. Tears flowed on their own. Caden didn't touch her. He didn't comfort her. He didn't say everything would be all right. He just sat beside her, in silence. An hour later, she stood up. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked at the bow. She reached out her hand. She touched the charred wood with her fingertips. And she said quietly that she would return tomorrow. She came back. And the next day, too. And the day after that. She came to the little room every evening. She sat in the corner, silently. Sometimes she watched Caden work. Sometimes she just sat with her eyes closed. On the 5th evening, she brought a bundle of firewood. On the 6th, a piece of dried venison. On the 7th night, she stayed over. She lay down on the floor by the door, like a dog, like a guard. Caden didn't argue. In the morning, he found 2 hares and a bundle of herbs by the door. The group of 2 became 3. 2 months until the exam. 630 copper coins in a tin can behind the 3rd box. Caden counted them every evening, precisely, patiently, like counting steps along a familiar path. Ha-Rin changed his life in 3 ways. First, safety. She followed him like a shadow. To the square, to the wasteland, back again, in silence, with a knife at her belt and eyes that saw everything. Caden stopped looking over his shoulder. Second, food. Ha-Rin hunted. Every morning before dawn, she would go beyond the walls. She'd return with game, rabbits, partridges, and sometimes fish from the stream beyond the wastelands. For the first time since he'd been in this world, Caden ate meat every day. His body responded. His arms grew stronger. His shoulders straightened. He no longer looked like a skeleton covered in skin. Third, silence. Ha-Rin didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand explanations. She was simply there. And this silence wasn't empty. It was like the silence of a workshop where 2 people are each working on their own tasks without getting in each other's way. Caden worked on the bow every evening, slowly, carefully. He didn't try to repair it physically. The wood was charred too deeply. A standard restoration wouldn't help. But he could do something else. He could restore the bow's voice, completely. Not just for 3 seconds, like with the old woman's brooch. Longer, deeper. To do that, he needed clean fragments, many of them, with a specific frequency, with a specific mood. Caden searched for them in the wastelands with a clear purpose, a new square every day, dozens of touches every day, a selection process every day. The pure ones here, the dirty ones there, the usable ones set aside. After 2 weeks, he had 9 fragments compatible with the bow, 9 things that resonated on the same wavelength: warmth, home, family, loyalty. A fragment of a door hinge, a shard of a clay bowl, a piece of a wrought iron fence, half a horseshoe, a thimble, a button from a child's shirt, a spoon, a scrap of a leather belt, and a small bell without a clapper. Each object remembered something simple and warm. The hinge remembered the door that was opened every evening. The bowl remembered the hands that ate from it. The fence remembered the yard where children played. The horseshoe remembered the horse the owner loved. The thimble remembered the seamstress who mended clothes at night. All these voices were quiet. All were forgotten. All lay in the junkyard like trash. Caden gathered them together. He arranged them around the bow on the table, each in its own place, like notes on a sheet of music. And he began. He didn't know exactly how it worked. No reference book described what he was doing. He was feeling his way, following his intuition, drawing on 20 years of experience as a restorer who knows that every object speaks its own language, and that sometimes 2 languages turn out to be 1. His right hand on the bow, his left on the first fragment, the loop. Warmth flowed. Slowly, not in jerks like before. Smoothly. Caden guided it. He didn't force it in. He offered it. The bow accepted it. Or didn't. The loop fit. The bow took in its warmth and came to life a little more. Caden moved on to the bowl, then to the fence. Each fragment gave up its own drop. Each drop awakened the bow. Memories of home, of people, of life before the fire. The process took 4 hours. By the end, Caden was lying face down on the floor. His hands wouldn't obey him. His head was splitting. There was a taste of blood in his mouth. He'd overdone it. 8 fragments out of 9. He ran out of strength on the 9th. Ha-Rin lifted him off the floor, silently. She dragged him to the cot, covered him with a blanket, brought him some water. Caden lay there, staring at the ceiling. The bow on the table glowed, quietly, with a warm orange light. The charred wood hadn't changed. The bowstring hadn't grown back. But the light came from within, from a memory that Caden had awakened. Ha-Rin looked at the bow for a long time. She stood by the table and looked. Then she reached out her hand. She took it, and the bow responded to her. Caden saw it in her face, an instantaneous change. Her eyes widened, her lips trembled. Her hand gripped the charred wood so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She heard it. Not for 3 seconds. Longer. Her brother's voice. His laughter. His words. "Nuna, shoot. I want you to live." Ha-Rin's son stood in the basement storeroom of the Appraisers Guild and wept. Silently. Not out of grief, because for the first time in 7 years, she had heard the voice she thought she'd lost forever. She pressed the bow to her chest. She stood there for a long time. Then she lowered it. She looked at Caden. His eyes were red and wet and alive. Alive for the first time. She said one word. "Thank you." Then she left. Caden was lying on the cot. His hands were shaking. The 9th fragment remained untouched, a bell without a clapper. He'd take it on tomorrow, or the day after, when his body let him. He closed his eyes. Daniel inside him said quietly, "It was worth it." Yes, it was worth it. In the morning, Ha-Rin returned, with 2 hares and a quiver of arrows. The arrows were new, store-bought. She placed them on the table next to the bow. Caden looked at her. She looked at him. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just picked up the bow and arrows and left. She returned an hour later. Her hands were trembling slightly. Her eyes were ablaze. She said she'd drawn the bowstring made from the tendons of the deer she'd hunted that morning. That the bow had accepted it. That she'd released the arrow. The first one in 7 years. It hit a tree 40 paces away, right in the center. She wasn't smiling, but she stood straighter, taller, as if something inside her that had been broken had snapped back into place with a click. Caden nodded. He said he was glad. Ha-Rin was silent for a moment. Then she sat down on the floor by the door. She placed the bow on her lap. She closed her eyes, and there she sat, leaning against the wall, with the bow on her lap, like a guardian, like a sentry, like someone who had found her place and had no intention of leaving. Evie came in that evening. She saw Ha-Rin. She looked at Caden. He explained, briefly. Evie looked at the bow, at the charred wood with a faint orange glow, at the new bowstring. She took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on, said the little room was getting cramped. Caden said he knew, said he needed a workshop, his own, a real one, with a workbench and tools and a roof big enough for 3. Evie asked how much money he had. He said, 600 copper coins. She said that wouldn't be enough for any workshop. He said he knew. That he was looking for another way. Evie was silent for a moment. Then she said she knew of a place, on the edge of the wastelands, an abandoned shed, a former guard post. The roof is full of holes. The walls are intact. The door is still there. Technically, it belongs to the city. Nobody needs it. The rent would be nominal, if anyone even remembered it existed. Caden looked at her. She shrugged. She said that appraisers know the city's real estate just as well as merchants do. It's part of the job. The shed was worse than Caden had hoped, and better than he'd feared. Stone walls, thick, solid, old masonry. The roof is wooden, 3 holes, 1 large one. An oak door, heavy. The hinges are rusty but still hold. Inside it's empty. Dust, cobwebs, the smell of dampness and old stone. 1 room, large. A former guard room. 4 windows, 2 boarded up. 2 are intact. Light comes through. A fireplace in the far wall, clogged with soot, but the chimney isn't ruined. Evie signed the lease for 3 copper coins a month. The city treasurer didn't even look at the paper. He signed it without looking. A shed on the edge of the wastelands. Who needs it? Caden needed it. They worked for 3 days, Caden and Ha-rin. Evie would come by after her shift and help until dark. Ha-rin hauled stones to patch the walls. Caden repaired the roof. He found planks and beams out in the wastelands, not new, but sturdy. Deep down, Daniel knew how to work with wood. Not perfect, but good enough to keep the roof from leaking. Evie hauled an old table from the guild's basement, one they were planning to throw away. The table became a workbench. Ha-rin found 2 stumps in the forest beyond the wastelands. They became chairs. Caden spent the whole day cleaning out the fireplace. By evening, it was blazing, for the first time in many years. The fire illuminated the stone walls. Shadows danced. Caden stood in the middle of the room and watched. There it was, his workshop. Holes in the walls, cracks in the floor, windows without glass covered with oiled cloth. 1 table, 2 tree stumps, a fireplace, and not a single tool. But it was his. The first place in both of his lives that was his alone. The next day he hung a sign on the door. He carved it with a knife on a small board. Orwell, I fix everything. Ha-rin looked at the sign. She didn't say anything. But the corner of her mouth twitched. Maybe. The first customers came from the square, those who already knew him. They brought small items, tarnished rings, cracked amulets, bent knives with traces of magic. Caden couldn't truly repair them, not without tools. But he could do what no one else could. He could give them back their voice. He could tell the owner a story. He could say that the object was still alive, that it remembered, that it was waiting. People walked away with their unrepaired items and a strange look on their faces, as if they'd been given back not an object, but a piece of themselves. They paid little. Caden didn't ask for much. On the 8th day after the workshop opened, there was a knock at the door. Quiet. Polite. Caden opened it. A girl was standing on the threshold. Young. Pale. Light brown hair down to her shoulders. A gray dress that reached her heels. Around her neck was a thin chain with a pendant. A circle with 7 dots. The symbol of the Church of the 7 Silent Ones. She said her name was Lyra Venn, that she was a novice of the church, that she had been tasked with monitoring the activities of Caden Orwell, that she would stay as long as necessary, and that, if he didn't mind, she'd like to sit down. Caden looked at her, then at Ha-rin. Ha-rin was standing against the wall, her hand on a knife, her eyes narrowed. Caden nodded. Ha-rin didn't remove her hand, but she didn't move. Caden stepped back from the door. He invited her in. Lyra entered. She sat down on a stump. She folded her hands in her lap. Her back was straight. Her gaze was downcast. She was quiet, pale, like a candle in an empty temple. She sat like that all day, watching Caden work. She didn't take notes. She didn't ask questions. She just watched. In the evening, she stood up. She thanked him. She left. She returned the next day, and the next, and the next. By the 3rd day, Caden had stopped noticing her presence. By the 5th, Ha-rin had stopped reaching for the knife when Lyra walked in. By the 7th, Lyra stayed the night. She said it was a long way to go, and she needed to be here early in the morning. She lay down on the floor by the fireplace, curled up in a ball, small, slender. In a gray dress, she looked like a mouse. Caden covered her with a blanket. She didn't wake up, or she pretended not to. During the day, she watched. In the evenings, she began to help. Not because she was asked to, because her hands were free. Sweeping the floor, lighting the fireplace, fetching water from the well behind the shed. Little things, quiet, unobtrusive. Caden noticed. On the 10th day, he was working on a cracked locket for a client. The locket had belonged to a soldier. The echoes were mixed, war, and tenderness. The soldier had worn the locket with a portrait of his wife. The portrait had long since worn away, but the locket still remembered the face. Caden could read it. Lyra stood nearby. She was watching. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw her lean forward. He saw her fingers clench. He saw her lips tremble. She was sensing something. Not through skill, not through magic, through something else. Caden finished the work. He handed the locket to the client. The client left. Caden looked at Lyra. He asked if everything was all right. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that in the church she'd been taught that objects have no soul, that attachment to objects is a sin of vanity, that memory lives only in prayer, not in metal, that what Caden does is heresy or deception. She fell silent. Caden waited. She said she'd seen the customer's face change when he got the locket back. She'd seen his fingers clench the metal. She'd seen him close his eyes. For a second. Just for a second. And that for that second, he wasn't here. He was with her. With the woman in the locket. Lyra said that if this was heresy, she didn't understand why heresy made people happy. Caden remained silent. Not because he didn't know what to say. Because he knew she had to finish her own thought. Lyra took the pendant off her neck, the symbol of the church, a circle with 7 dots. She placed it on the workbench in front of him. She said quietly that it had broken, a long time ago, that she just hadn't noticed. She asked him to fix it. Caden picked up the pendant. He placed it in the palm of his hand. He closed his eyes. The pendant was cold, dead. Not a drop of magic, not a trace of memory. Silver and emptiness. No one had put anything into this thing. They'd been stamped out by the hundreds at the church's mint, one after another. Identical. Empty. He opened his eyes. He looked at Lyra. He told her the truth. He told her there was nothing in the pendant, that it was empty. Not broken, just empty. It had never been alive. Lyra stood motionless. There was no surprise on her face, only a quiet acknowledgement of what she already knew. She took the pendant, put it in her pocket, didn't put it back around her neck. She said she'd stay a little longer, if possible. Caden nodded. She stayed. From that day on, Lyra Venn stopped wearing the symbol of the church. 3 months after waking up in the wastelands. 840 copper coins in the bank. 6 weeks until the exam. 160 copper coins until she had the amount she needed. Caden did the math and knew he'd make it in time, if nothing happened. Something did happen. That morning in the square, a boy of about 10 approached him. Ragged, barefoot. He held out a rolled-up sheet of paper and ran off. Caden unrolled it. The paper was thick, expensive. The letters were neat, written in ink, not soot. The text was short. Caden Orwell was invited to appear at the Hallgren branch of the Forge of Rebirth to discuss the terms of cooperation. Tomorrow, noon. Address, signature. The manager of the Hallgren branch of the Forge, a member of the Vaughn family. Caden read it twice. He folded it up. He put it in his pocket. That evening in the workshop, he showed the letter to Evie. She read it. She turned pale. She said it wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. The Forge doesn't invite trash collectors to discuss a partnership. The Forge summons those it intends to buy or destroy. Ha-Rin stood by the wall. She listened. Lyra sat by the fireplace. She was listening too. Caden asked Evie what she knew about the local forge. Evie knew a lot. The Hallgren Renaissance Forge was one of the 12 branches of the One Cartel. Not the largest, but not the smallest either. It controlled reforging throughout the entire province. 40 master smiths, 200 apprentices, warehouses, laboratories, contracts with the Adventurers Guild for the initial processing of ore, ties to the aristocracy, ties to the courts, ties to the city guard, an annual turnover in the tens of thousands of gold pieces. And at the head of it all stood the Vaughn family. An old industrial family, 3 generations of blacksmiths. The head of the family, Hammond Vaughn, was based in the provincial capital. His trusted representative managed the local branch. Caden asked what would happen if he didn't show up. Evi said nothing good. The forge would take it as a sign of disrespect. The pressure would begin. Quietly, through suppliers, through landlords, through the guard. They wouldn't beat him. They would strangle him, slowly, methodically, until he suffocated. Caden asked what would happen if he did show up. Evie said it depended on what they offered him. If it was a contract to work for the forge, that would be the end of him. He'd become their property. His skill would serve their reforging. Authenticity assessments for their clients, appraisals for their craftsmen, everything under their control, for a fixed fee, with no right to work on the side. If he refuses, they'll move on to Plan B, pressure. Caden sat on a stump and thought. Daniel inside him calmly weighed his options. In his past life, he'd worked with antique dealers. He knew this type of person. Business, not evil, not good. Business. They don't hate you. They just can't let you exist if you threaten their income. Nothing personal. He'll go. He had no choice. Not going would mean starting a war he wasn't ready for. Going meant seeing the enemy up close, figuring out what he wanted, finding a weakness. That morning, Caden put on the cleanest shirt he had. He tucked it into his pants. He smoothed his hair. He left the shard of the sword in the workshop. No need to show them everything you have. He tucked the buckle into an inside pocket. For himself, for confidence. Harin went with him. He didn't ask. She didn't ask. She just got up and went. Kuzni's office was located in the city center, a large stone building with a wide facade, dark wooden doors. The sign was pasted, a circle and an anvil. Guards at the entrance, 2 men, armed. Not city guards, private. Harin stayed outside. She stood against the wall across from the entrance. She crossed her arms. Caden went inside. A hallway, a stone floor, torches in the walls, the smell of metal and hot oil. A secretary at a desk, young, indifferent. He led Caden down the hallway to a door at the far end. He opened it. Caden entered. The office was large, heavy furniture, a dark oak desk, leather-upholstered chairs, samples on the walls, swords, shields, daggers, all gleaming, all reforged. Daniel, inside him, quickly assessed each one. Average workmanship, good polish, poor tempering. Typical mass-produced goods from the forge. Quantity over quality. A person was sitting at the desk, not the one Caden had expected, not the manager. A woman, young, 25, maybe 26, blonde hair pulled back into a neat bun, back straight, posture impeccable, a beautiful face. Cold, like a blade. Dressed expensively, but without ostentation. A dark dress, a silver brooch on the collar. The mark of Kuzni Vaughn. She sat at the table and looked at him. She didn't stand up. She didn't say hello. She just looked. The way one appraises merchandise. Caden stood in front of the table and waited. She spoke first. She said the manager was busy, that she was here in his place, that her name was Sadie Vaughn. Caden didn't move. He didn't flinch. But Daniel inside him instantly ran through all the possibilities. Vaughn. Not a hired manager. Family. Hammond Vaughn's daughter. Sent personally, from the provincial capital, for an F-rank scavenger from Hallgren. That meant he'd been noticed. Not the local branch, headquarters. Sadie said she knew about him, that reports had reached her. A scavenger who hears things, who publicly exposes reforgings in the square, who restored the voice in a dead brooch, who brought a charred bow back to life. She said it was interesting, that her father was interested, that the cartel is ready to offer Caden a position, staff appraiser consultant for the Kuznyevan. Salary, 50 silver coins a month. Housing, a workshop. Tools, access to materials, protection for his family. Status, everything he hadn't been able to achieve on his own over the years. Right now. One condition, exclusivity. Work only for the forge. No outside commissions, no private workshop, no independent work. His skill belongs to the forge. Caden listened. His face was calm. 50 silver coins. 5,000 copper coins a month. More than he'd earn in a year in the marketplace. A workshop with real tools. A roof over his head. Food. Safety. Everything. Everything he clings to with his fingernails every day. Served on a silver platter. Daniel inside him said quietly, "Look at the swords on the walls." Caden looked. 6 swords, all gleaming, all reforged, all dead. 6 objects that were once alive, that had stories, owners, voices. The forge had erased everything, cleaned it all away, polished it, hung it on the wall as decoration. Caden looked at Sadie. He said he was grateful for the offer, that he appreciated the Vaughn family's interest, and that he was forced to decline. Silence. Sadie's expression didn't change, not a hint of emotion. She asked why. Caden said that his ability only worked when he was working for a specific person, for a specific story. He couldn't read on a schedule. He couldn't assess things on the forge's orders. Things reveal themselves to him because he approaches them with respect, not with a contract. Sadie was silent. She looked at him. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Not anger, interest. She said he was either very brave or very foolish. That turning down the Vaughn Forge in this city was like turning down air. That she would relay his answer to her father, and that he'd better hope her father would take it with a sense of humor. She stood up, walked around the desk, passed him on her way to the door, stopped in the doorway, turned around, looked at his hands, dirty, calloused, with broken nails, the hands of a garbage collector. She said one sentence. She said that he had the hands of a craftsman, not a garbage collector, and that it was a shame. She left. Caden stood in the empty office. His heart was pounding. He had just turned down the most powerful industrial family in the province. 50 silver coins, a workshop, protection. He had turned it down. For the sake of a dilapidated shed on the edge of the dump. For 2 copper coins per item. For the sign on the door. Orwell, I fix everything. Daniel inside him said quietly, "You did the right thing." Caden stepped out of the office. Ha-Rin was standing by the wall across from him, right where he'd left her. She was looking at him. He nodded. She nodded back. They walked home. To the shed on the edge of the wastelands. To the workbench made from an old table. To the fireplace that smokes when the wind blows from the north. To the sign that had already begun to darken from the rain. Home. Kuzny's reply came a week later. Not a letter, not a threat. Silence. A scrap dealer on Craftsman Street refused to buy metal from Caden. He said he no longer took anything from scavengers. His eyes darted around. He was lying. Caden didn't argue. He went to a second scrap dealer. That one refused too. And a third. And the fourth. By the end of the day, not a single dealer in Hallgren would take his goods. Pressure. Quiet. Methodical, just as Evi had predicted. Things got worse in the square. Merchants who had previously tolerated his presence began to shoo him away. Not all of them, but enough. One spat at his feet. Another said that if the scavenger didn't clear out, they'd break his fingers. Harin stepped forward. Caden stopped her with a hand. They left. Customers were still coming, but less often. People were afraid. The Wand Forge was a force to be reckoned with. To get involved with the forge was putting pressure on meant coming under pressure yourself. Caden understood that. He accepted it. He wasn't angry. Anger is useless, he thought. Daniel inside him was weighing his options. In his past life, he'd seen major dealers put pressure on small restorers. They cut them off from suppliers, poached their clients, ruined their reputations. There was only one solution. Do something no one else could replicate. Something that would put you above the pressure. Something that couldn't be dismissed. The opportunity presented itself. In the third week of the pressure campaign, a man came into the workshop. Not young, dressed richly. A fur-lined cloak, thin leather gloves, soft boots, expensive ones. On his finger was a ring bearing a coat of arms. A lord. Not of the highest rank, but a real one. Provincial nobility. Harin tensed by the door. Lyra rose from her seat by the fireplace. Caden stood up from behind the workbench. The lord entered and stopped in the middle of the room. He looked around. Stone walls, cracks, oiled cloth on the windows. A workbench made from an old table. Stumps instead of chairs. He wasn't impressed. But he didn't leave either. He said his name was Alden Torin, that he was Lord Hallgren, that rumors had reached him about a scavenger who could hear things, that he'd come to check it out, and that if the rumors were true, he had a job for him. Caden asked what kind. Lord Alden pulled a bundle from under his cloak. He unwrapped it. A sword. An old one. A very old one. The blade was covered in dark spots. The hilt was wrapped in decaying leather. The guard was bent. The scabbard was missing. The sword was broken. Not in half. Worse. A crack ran from the tip to the hilt along the entire length of the blade. Thin, almost invisible. But Caden saw it. Daniel saw it. A crack along which the blade could split with a single blow. The Lord said it was his great-grandfather's sword, that his great-grandfather had carried it into the Battle of the Silver Plains, that after his great-grandfather's death, the sword had been passed down through the family. The Lord's father had carried it for 30 years. Then his father died, 10 years ago. The sword lay in the family vault. Lord Alden took it out once a year on the anniversary of his father's death. He hung it on the wall. He lit a candle. He remained silent. Last year, the sword fell from the wall. It cracked. The Lord took it to the forge. The blacksmith said the sword was beyond repair. The crack was too deep. The only option was to reforge it. But reforging it would destroy everything that made his great-grandfather's sword what it was. The Lord refused. He took the sword back. He kept it in a chest. And now he had come here, to the junk dealer, because he had nowhere else to go. Caden took the sword, carefully, with both hands. He placed it on the workbench. He sat down beside it. He closed his eyes, placed his palms on the blade, and sank into it. The sword was deep, deeper than anything he'd ever held before. Layers of memory stretched downward like rings in a tree trunk. The top layer, Lord Alden, his hand on the hilt, a candle, the silence of an empty hall, longing for a father who was no longer there. Deeper, Lord Alden's father, 30 years with this sword at his belt. Not a warrior, a bureaucrat. He carried the sword not for battle, for remembrance. Every morning he touched the hilt. He thought of his father, of his great-grandfather, of his lineage, of what it meant to be a Torrens. Even deeper, his great-grandfather, a warrior, a true one, the battle of the Silver Plains, rain, mud, blood. His great-grandfather stood in the front row, sword in hand, fear in his gut. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who was afraid but stood his ground anyway, because behind him were the people he had vowed to protect. Caden went deeper. At the very bottom, the blacksmith, the one who forged this sword, an old man with crooked fingers. He had imbued the blade with a single thought, a single prayer. Protect the one who holds you. Bring him home. Caden opened his eyes. His cheeks were wet. He hadn't noticed when he'd started crying. Lord Alden stood before him, waiting. Caden said the sword was alive, that the crack hadn't killed it, that 4 generations of memories lay within, that his great-grandfather had been afraid before the battle, that Lord Alden's father had thought of him every morning, that the blacksmith who forged the blade had imbued it with a prayer for a safe return home. Lord Alden didn't move. His face was set in stone. Caden said he could restore the sword's voice, not completely, only as much as the intact fragments would allow, that the process would take time, that he needed a week. The Lord nodded, once, briefly. He left the sword. He walked away. Caden worked for 7 days. He barely slept. Herin brought him food and made sure he drank water. Lyra sat by the fireplace and watched in silence. Evie came every evening and wrote down everything she saw. Caden gathered 12 fragments, all pure, all resonating in harmony with the sword. Loyalty, protection, home. He worked on each one separately. He drew out the echo. He offered it to the sword. The sword accepted or rejected it. Some fragments didn't work. 7 out of 12 took root. 5 fell away. On the 7th day, the sword sang, not with sound, with vibration. Caden held it in his hands and felt 4 generations of memory rise to the surface. The crack hadn't disappeared. The blade hadn't become new, but it was alive. More alive than any reforged blade in the city. Lord Alden arrived on the 8th morning. Caden handed over the sword. He said the crack remained, that the sword was unfit for battle, but now it spoke. He asked the Lord to take the sword in his hands and hold it. The Lord took it. He gripped the hilt and froze. His face changed, slowly, like the sunrise. His lips trembled, his eyes closed. He stood in the workshop on the edge of the wastelands and listened. His father's voice. A name he hadn't heard in 30 years. His name, uttered in a way only his father knew how. Softly, warmly, just like when he was a child. Lord Alden opened his eyes. Tears were streaming down his cheeks. He wasn't ashamed. He stood there and wept, silently. Then he sheathed the sword. He looked at Caden. He asked how much he owed. Caden said 2 copper coins. Lord Alden looked at him for a long time. Then he took his purse. He placed it on the workbench. He said it wasn't payment. It was a start. And he left. That evening, a rumor spread through the city. Lord Halgren had been crying in a scavenger's workshop, and those weren't tears of sorrow. After Lord Alden's visit, the world around Caden changed. Not immediately, not abruptly, but noticeably. The Lord didn't speak of what had happened in the workshop. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't boast. But people saw. They saw him carrying the sword. Not in the vault, on his belt, every day, just like his father, just like his great-grandfather. And they saw his face, the face of a man to whom something very important had been returned. That was enough. Customers began to return, not the ones who'd been afraid of the forge, but new ones, those who'd heard the story and believed it. An old blacksmith from the western outskirts brought his master's hammer. The handle was cracked, the head was loose. The blacksmith couldn't work with that hammer. But he couldn't throw it away either. Caden restored the teacher's voice to the hammer. 3 seconds. The old man stood with the hammer in his hands and listened as his mentor, who had died 20 years ago, told him that he was a good blacksmith, that he hadn't let him down. A woman from the harbor district brought some baby shoes, tiny ones, worn out. Her daughter had died as an infant 15 years ago. The shoes were the only thing left. Caden held them in his hands and smelled the scent of milk and warm skin and someone's laughter. Quiet, high-pitched, a child's. He couldn't bring the woman's daughter back, but he gave her back the sound. 3 seconds of a child's laughter. The woman stood there, pressing the shoes to her face and swaying as if in the wind. Every day brought someone new. Every day, Caden listened to other people's things and returned other people's voices. And every day he grew more exhausted. The burden. Daniel remembered the burden. Every fragment carried with it not only warmth, but also heaviness. Other people's memories settled inside him like dust in his lungs. He began to have dreams that weren't his own. The battlefield of the Lord's great-grandfather, the old blacksmith's workshop, the cradle of a baby who never woke up. Other people's lives, other people's deaths, other people's tears. He would wake up in the middle of the night and for a few seconds not remember his own name, Daniel or Caden. Caden, or the soldier from the Silver Plains, or the blacksmith with crooked fingers, or the mother rocking an empty cradle. Rin noticed. She slept by the door and heard him toss and turn. She heard him sit up on the cot and breathe heavily in the darkness. She didn't say anything. But in the morning, the food was hot and the portions grew larger. Lyra noticed too. She would approach quietly. She'd sit down beside him. She wouldn't speak. She'd just sit there. Sometimes she'd place her small, cold hand on his wrist, and at that touch, the unfamiliar voices would recede. Caden didn't understand why. Maybe there was something unique about Lyra, a kind of silence that drowned out the noise. Evie came by less often. Work at the guild had piled up. But when she did come, she brought books. Guides on protection against the mental effects of artifacts, detuning techniques, breathing exercises. Caden read them. He tried them. Some helped. Most didn't, because the manuals were written for people who carried a single artifact, not for someone who let dozens of other people's lives pass through him every day. He needed a different method, one of his own. He found it in the wastelands. By accident. He was digging in the southwestern sector. Deep. 3 meters. Deeper than usual. The shovel he'd borrowed from Rin struck something hard. He cleared away the dirt. A stone. No, not a stone. A slab. Smooth. Gray. Warm. With a faint scent of a thunderstorm. There were markings on the surface. Not letters, not runes. Something older. Something that predated alphabets. Caden placed his hand on the slab, and nothing happened. No echo, no memory, no voice. Silence. Absolute, complete, pure. As if the slab were not an object, but the absence of an object. A hole in a world where things speak. He withdrew his hand. The silence vanished. All the voices returned. All the fragments of others' dreams. The entire burden. He placed his hand back on it. Silence. Pure. Cool. Like diving into a lake on a hot day. Caden sat at the bottom of the pit with his palm on the warm stove and breathed. For the first time in weeks, his mind was quiet. Completely quiet. Just him, Daniel and Caden. No one else. He sat there for an hour. Then he climbed back up. He filled in the pit. He memorized the spot. He returned to the workshop. That evening, he lay on the cot for a long time, thinking. The slab was old. Very old. Older than anything else he'd found. And it didn't speak. It was silent. But not because it was empty, because it was full. So full that its voice had merged into the silence, like white noise that contains all frequencies at once and therefore seems like silence. Caden knew he had found something important, something that was part of this world's mystery. But now was not the time to dig deeper. Now was the time to prepare for the exam. It was 3 weeks away. He had enough money, and enough knowledge, too. Evie had him poring over catalogs every evening. Names, dates, ranks, classifications, types of metals, magical spectra, evaluation standards. Caden memorized them. Daniel helped. 20 years of working with antiques meant that he already possessed half of this knowledge in an adapted form. Stones and metals, organic and synthetic materials, markings and forgeries. The system was different. The principles were the same. Ha-Rin began patrolling the area around the workshop every night. Caden didn't ask her to. She didn't explain. She simply left after sunset and returned before dawn. Sometimes she brought back information. 2 people had been watching the workshop the day before yesterday. Yesterday, 3. Today, no one. The forge was keeping an eye on things, waiting, choosing its moment. Lyra stopped leaving altogether. She lived in the workshop. She slept by the fireplace. She helped with cleaning and cooking. She was silent. She thought. Sometimes Caden caught her gaze on Rin or at the shard of a sword on the shelf. She looked at these things as one looks at a miracle, with the quiet wonder of a child seeing for the first time that the world is bigger than they'd been told. One evening she asked, quietly, almost in a whisper. She asked if the gods hear when people pray, or if prayers are also empty, like her pendant. Caden thought for a long time. Then he said he didn't know if the gods could hear, but he knew that objects could hear, that every prayer spoken over an object leaves a trace, and that if the gods were once objects themselves, then they remember every word. Lyra remained silent for the rest of the evening. Then she said quietly that it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard about the gods, and that the church would kill him for those words. Caden said the church had tried. They were both silent. Then Lyra laughed softly. For the first time in all the time Caden had known her. A quiet laugh, like a bell. Ha-Rin, standing by the door, raised an eyebrow. Caden smiled. A small workshop on the edge of the wastelands. 4 people. A fireplace. A teapot. Silence. It was home. The exam was in a week. Caden was preparing, but the world wouldn't wait. At dawn on the 6th day before the exam, Evie burst into the workshop. No knock, no greeting. Her face was pale. Her glasses were askew. She clutched her notebook to her chest so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She said that the forge had filed a complaint with the Guild Council, an official one, against Caden Orwell. The charges? Illegal appraisal activities without a license, fraud, undermining trust in the ranking system, misleading citizens through false statements about the properties of artifacts, a fine, confiscation of property, a ban on any activity related to the vessels, possibly arrest. The council hearing is in 5 days, 1 day before the exam. Caden sat on a stump, staring at the wall. Daniel, inside him, calmly assessed the situation. A legal attack. Not a physical one. That's good. That means the Forge wants to destroy him cleanly. By law, by the rules, on their turf. The problem is that on their turf, they're invincible. The law was on the Forge's side. Technically, Caden was indeed working without a license. Technically, his claims about the properties of objects had no legal standing. Technically, he was an F-rank scavenger who had overstepped the bounds of his skill. Caden asked Evie if there was any chance. Evie said there was one, a public demonstration. At the council meeting, Caden has the right to demand a practical demonstration of his abilities. If the council sees with their own eyes that he can do what he claims, the fraud charge will be dropped. The question of the license remains, but that's just a fine, not arrest, not confiscation. He'd still be able to live. Caden asked who would be on the council. Evie listed them. 3 senior assessors from the guild, a representative from the city council, and a representative from the Forge of Rebirth. Caden asked who would be representing the Forge. Evie said, Sadie Vaughn. Of course. Who else? 5 days. Caden didn't spend them preparing for the exam. He spent them preparing for the council. He needed one item, just one that would prove everything, one that would silence the room, one that couldn't be disputed, couldn't be called a fraud, couldn't be explained away as a coincidence. He thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he went to Lord Alden. He asked for a meeting. The Lord agreed. Caden told him straight out that the Forge had filed a complaint, that the hearing was in 2 days, that he needed help. Not money, not a defense, just one item. The Lord listened. Caden explained. He needed an item that belonged to the Forge, a reforged item, anyone, from their own production. An item about which the Forge knows everything, its history, specifications, rank. Everything is documented. Everything has been verified. Caden will examine it before the council and reveal what is missing from every document, what the Forge erased during reforging. Lord Alden was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. He said he had such an item. A dagger purchased from Kuznia Vaughn 3 years ago. The paperwork is in order. Rank C. Reforged from a shard dating back to the War of the Silver Plains. Pure. Controllable. Officially appraised by the guild. He handed the dagger to Caden. Caden took it. He didn't scan it. Not now. At the council. In front of everyone. Meeting day. Caden put on a clean shirt. He smoothed his hair. He arrived at the guild building an hour before the start. Hei Rin stayed outside. Lyra, too. Evi was waiting inside. She led him into the hall. It was large, with stone walls. There was a long table for the council and chairs for observers. There were a lot of people. Word of the meeting had spread. Merchants had come, artisans, minor aristocrats, curious onlookers. Lord Alden sat in the front row. At the council table were 3 senior appraisers, elderly, stern, and clad in guild robes. A representative from the city council, short and nervous, and Sadie Vaughn, in a dark dress with a silver forge brooch. Her face was calm, beautiful, and cold. She looked at Caden when he entered. She didn't nod. She didn't look away. She simply noted his presence, the way one notes an object on a scale. The hearing began. The Forge's representative read the charges, the same points that Evie had listed: illegal activity, fraud, undermining public trust. The senior assessor asked Caden what he had to say in his defense. Caden stood up. He said he did not dispute the lack of a license, that he was willing to pay the fine, but that the charge of fraud was false, that he could prove his abilities right now, right here, in front of everyone. He asked for permission to give a practical demonstration. The council deliberated, briefly. They granted permission. Caden took out Lord Alden's dagger. He placed it on the table in front of the council. He said it was a reforged piece from the Vaughn Forge, rank C. The paperwork was in order. He asked a representative from the forge to confirm it. Sadie looked at the dagger. She nodded. She confirmed it. The Vaughn Forge, reforged, rank C, 3 years ago. Everything was correct. Caden took the dagger. He placed it in the palm of his hand. He closed his eyes. The hall fell silent. The echo came in 2 layers. The top layer, clear, smooth. The reforging had done its job. It had erased almost everything. Caden passed through it, as if through the icy crust on a pond. Beneath the crust was the lower layer, the one the forge had considered destroyed. It hadn't been destroyed. It had been silenced, buried. Like a city beneath volcanic ash. Caden dug, mentally, carefully, just as he would have dug in the wastelands, layer by layer, and he reached the bottom. The dagger remembered. The dagger remembered everything. He opened his eyes. The hall was silent. 100 faces were staring at him. Caden began to speak, quietly, steadily. He said that before it was reforged, this dagger had been part of a longsword, that the sword had belonged to a woman, a warrior. Her name was Selma. She was from a border garrison, 32 years old, left-handed. He said the sword had broken in battle, not from a blow, from overexertion. Too much magic had been channeled through the blade in too short a time. The sword couldn't withstand it and snapped. A shard wounded Selma in the thigh. She survived. The sword did not. He said the shard had lain on the battlefield for 120 years. Then an adventurer found it, sold it to the forge. The forge reforged it. Erased Selma. Erased her left stance. Erased the sound of her voice as she commanded the ranks. It erased the scent of wormwood from the border step. It erased everything. And it produced a C-rank dagger. Clean, controllable. Without a history. The room was silent. Caden placed the dagger on the table. Sadie Vaughn sat motionless. Her expression didn't change, but her hands, resting on her knees, were clenched into fists. The senior appraiser asked if they could verify this information. Caden said they could. The name was Selma, a border garrison, 120 years ago. If the Guild's archives contained records of garrisons from that period, the name should be there. The appraiser looked at Evie. Evie stood up. She said she'd check. She left. She returned 20 minutes later with a folder. She opened it. She read aloud. Selma Deer, Stone Pass Border Garrison. Warrior, left-handed, rank B. Died in retirement 8 years after being wounded in the thigh by a shard from her own sword. The room exhaled. The council looked at Caden. Sadie Vaughn looked at Caden. Lord Alden looked at Caden. All of Halgren was looking at Caden. And Caden stood before them, skinny, in a clean but patched shirt, an F-rank scavenger. And he was silent, because everything had already been said. The council dropped the fraud charge. The fine for working without a license remained. 5 silver, half his savings. Caden paid, without a word. The next day he took the exam. He scored the highest mark on the theory portion. On the practical portion, he received a special distinction. None of the examiners had ever seen anything like it. He was issued an apprentice appraiser's license, a temporary one, for 1 year, with the right to renew. The first F-rank scavenger in the Guild's history to hold an appraiser's license. Evie stood beside him as he was handed the document. She held her notebook pressed against her chest. She smiled, quietly, just the corners of her lips. Caden took the document. He looked at it. Paper with watermarks, the Guild seal. His name: Caden Orwell, apprentice appraiser. It was a sheet of paper. Just paper. But deep down, Daniel knew that paper was a thing too, and that thing would remember this moment. The workshop changed over the following weeks. Lord Alden sent a carpenter. The roof was properly repaired. The windows were glazed. The door was replaced with a new one, with a lock. Caden didn't ask for it. The Lord didn't ask. He just sent it. Clients came in droves. After the council meeting, the whole town heard about Caden, not just Hallgren. Neighboring settlements, merchants from caravans, travelers, adventurers passing through town, the scavenger who hears things, who brought back the voice to the Lord's sword, who knows the names of the dead, who repairs what the forge considers junk. Money started coming in. Not much, but enough. Caden bought tools, real ones, a hammer, vices, files, clamps, a blowtorch, a metalworking kit. Daniel inside him wept with joy when they were laid on the workbench for the first time. 20 years in his past life and a few months in this one. Finally, real tools. He began to truly repair things, not just voices, metal, wood, bone, stone. Objects came to him broken and left alive, not new, alive, with scars, with a history, but alive. Word got to Sadie 1. She didn't come through the office, in person, in the evening, without security, in a plain coat without the forge's emblem. She knocked on the door. Ha-Rin opened it. She tensed. Sadie looked at her calmly. She asked permission to enter. Ha-Rin looked at Caden. Caden nodded. Sadie came in. She looked around the workshop, the new roof, the glass windows, the workbench with tools, the fireplace with a teapot, 4 sleeping spots. Lyra by the fireplace, Evie at the table with a notebook. Ha-Rin stood by the door with her hand on a knife. Sadie sat down on a stump. She was silent for a minute. Then she said she hadn't come on her father's behalf, that her father didn't know she was here, that she'd come on her own. Caden was waiting. Sadie pulled an object from under her cloak. Small, wooden, a sword, a child's, a toy, broken in half. The halves were tied together with twine. She placed it on the workbench. She said it was her younger brother's sword, Thomas. He died at age 11. A fever, 18 years ago. Sadie was 8. Thomas used to carry that wooden sword everywhere. He played at being a knight, a hero, a savior of the world. When he died, her father ordered all his belongings to be thrown away. Sadie hid the sword. It was the only thing she managed to save. She'd carried it with her for 18 years. She tied it up when it broke. She didn't turn it into the forge. She knew they'd send it to the smelter. There was nothing to reforge there, just a piece of wood, a toy. Trash. She felt silent. Her face was calm. Her voice was steady. Only her fingers on her knees trembled slightly. Caden took the sword, carefully. He untied the string. He placed both halves in the palm of his hand. He closed his eyes. A boy, 11 years old, blonde hair like his sister's. Laughter, lots of laughter. He ran around the courtyard of a huge house, swinging a wooden sword. He shouted that he was Sir Thomas and that all dragons should fear him. His sister ran after him. She tried to catch him. He dodged her. He laughed. He fell. He got up. He ran again. The wooden sword remembered his hands. Small, warm, always on the move. It remembered how he'd fall asleep hugging the sword. It remembered how he'd whisper to it before bed that tomorrow, together, they'd defeat all the villains. Caden opened his eyes. Sadie was sitting on a stump. Her back was straight. Her face was stony. Her hands rested on her knees. Perfect posture. The Iron Bride, head of the delegation, Hammond Vaughn's daughter. Caden quietly told her what he had seen: the courtyard, running, laughter, dragons that needed to be defeated, his sister who couldn't catch him, and the whisper before bedtime. Sadie didn't move. She just listened. When he finished, the workshop was silent. Harin stood by the door, staring at the wall. Lyra sat by the fireplace with her eyes closed. Evie held a notebook but wasn't writing. Sadie One sat on a stump in the scavenger's workshop on the edge of the wastelands and cried. Silently. Just like Harin that first evening. Tears streamed down her face, which remained unchanged. Her back was straight. Her hands rested on her knees. Only tears. Caden didn't touch her. He didn't comfort her. He just worked. Quietly. With his hands. He joined the two halves of a wooden sword. Not with magic, with glue and twine and careful fingers. Daniel repaired a child's toy just as he would have repaired a violin. With the same respect. With the same love. An hour later, the sword was whole. Not new, with a visible seam. With a history. But whole. Caden laid it on the workbench. He activated the last remaining clean fragment, the bell without a clapper. The very one that hadn't fit his bow. Rin's bow. The bell's warmth passed into the wood. The sword trembled. And a sound came from it. Quiet. A child's laughter. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Sadie Vaughn reached out, took the sword, pressed it to her chest. She closed her eyes. And for 4 seconds, Thomas was by her side again. She left late. At the door, she turned around. She looked at Caden. She said she'd tell her father that the garbage collector from Halgren wasn't a threat to Kuzni, that he was something else, something she hadn't yet found the words for. But she would. The door closed. Caden stood in the workshop. Harin, Lyra, Evie. 3 pairs of eyes. 3 silences. Each its own. He sat down at the workbench, placed his hands on the wood, closed his eyes. Daniel inside him said quietly, "You don't fix things. You fix people." Yes, that's exactly right. Winter came early to Halgren. The first snow fell on the wastelands at the beginning of the month and covered the endless field of debris with a white blanket. Everything looked different under the snow. Cleaner, quieter. As if the world had closed its eyes and fallen into thought. Caden stood by the workshop window, gazing at the white hills. A year. Almost a year since that day when he'd opened his eyes, face down in a pile of rusty spearheads. A year since that first breath of unfamiliar air, since that first shard that responded to his touch. The workshop was warm. The fireplace burned steadily. Tools lay on the workbench. Boxes of fragments stood on the shelves. Clean, sorted, labeled, each with a name and a story. A sign hung on the wall. That very one. The first one. Orwell. I fix everything. It had darkened with age. The letters had worn away at the edges, but it was still there. Lyra was sitting by the fireplace. She was reading. Not a church book, a handbook on the classification of vessels. Evie had given her her copy. Lyra read slowly. She traced the lines with her finger. Sometimes she looked up and gazed at the shelves with the fragments. She was comparing what she was reading with what she saw every day. Harin was outside, patrolling, or hunting, or simply standing on roof of the shed, gazing into the distance. She did this often. Standing high up with her bow on her back, she would silently look toward the north, toward where her clan was, toward where home was. She no longer cried, but she still looked. Evie would come in the evening, after work, with a teapot and a notebook. She'd filled 7 notebooks this year. Every page a description of her readings, every paragraph a new discovery. She was preparing a report for the Guild Council, an official one. on revising the classification of the scavenger skill, on introducing a new category. She hadn't found a name for it yet. She was working on it. 4 women, 4 broken stories, 4 lives that had crossed paths in a dilapidated shed on the edge of the dump and found something there that none of them could name. Caden smiled. He turned away from the window, put on his jacket, went outside. The wastelands were quiet under the snow. He walked along a familiar path toward the southwestern sector, to that place, to the slab. He came here once a week. He would sit down, place his palm on the warm stone, and listen to the silence. The silence gave him peace. It washed away the voices of others. It brought him back to himself. But today he wasn't seeking peace. Today he was seeking an answer. He cleared away the snow, brushed it off with his mitten. The slab lay in the same spot, it jet black, warm despite the frost, with a faint scent of a thunderstorm. The markings on its surface glowed faintly in the morning light. Caden sat down on the edge of the pit. He placed both palms on the stone. He closed his eyes. And for the first time, he didn't just listen to the silence. He went deeper. The skill responded immediately, as if it had been waiting, as if this entire year had been preparation for this moment. The silence parted. Beyond it was not silence. Beyond it was a voice. One, enormous, like nothing, like the ocean. A voice that didn't speak in words. It spoke through sensations, through images, through scales that the human mind cannot comprehend. Caden saw, not with his eyes, with something deeper. He saw how this world was born, how 7 beings stood above the void and created. Stone, water, sky, earth, life. They were not gods in the sense that humans understand the word. They were masters, blacksmiths, restorers. They took the void and made a world out of it, just as Caden took the fragments and made them whole. Then he saw war, the war of the 7 crowns. Not a human war, a divine one. 7 entities were arguing about what the world should be like, about who it belonged to, about whether to repair what was broken or to reforge it anew. Reforge. That word pierced Caden like lightning. They were arguing about the same thing, about the very same question. Restoration or reforging, to preserve the old or to create the new. The argument escalated into war. The war destroyed them. It didn't kill them. It shattered them. Like a sword that had channeled too much magic through itself. They were blown to pieces, into thousands of pieces, fragments of divine bodies scattered across the world. They sank into the earth, into stone, into metal. People found them, not knowing what they were. They forged them into weapons, smelted them into armor, soldered them into rings. Every ancient artifact in this world is a shard of a god. Every forge of rebirth grinds a divine body into a compliant tool. Every wasteland is a graveyard. The voice fell silent. Caden sat on the edge of the pit, his palms resting on the warm stone. His face was wet with tears. His hands were trembling. He understood. The slab beneath his hands was not just a shard. It was a fragment of the one among them who knew how to assemble, the God of restoration. The one who, in the War of the 7, stood for preservation, for repair, for mending rather than breaking. He had lost. He had been shattered. His shards lay deeper than the rest, because he himself had asked for it. He didn't want to be put back together by force. He wanted someone to come who would understand, someone who knew how to listen, someone who would ask before repairing. And he called out, across worlds, through time, through death. The soul of a restorer from a workshop on the 3rd floor in Boston. the soul of a man who had spent his whole life hearing things. Caden took his hands off the stove. The voice fell silent. Silence returned. Ordinary, winter silence. With the crunch of snow and the distant cry of crows. He sat there for a long time, thinking. Daniel inside him was silent too. For the first time, they were silent together. Not like two voices in one body, like a single person who had finally understood who he was. The God Restorer wanted to be put back together. His fragments lie scattered across the world. Hundreds of fragments. In each one, a piece of the one who knew how to repair the universe. Caden could start putting them together. Right now. The slab beneath his hands was the first fragment. The largest, the most important. The heart. If he starts, sooner or later he'll gather enough for the God to awaken. And then the world will change. Forever. Or not. Because the God himself wanted to break. He himself asked for his shards to be buried deeper. He himself chose not to be. And here's the question. Does a restorer have the right to repair something that chose to break on its own? Caden sat on the edge of the pit in the snow and thought about this. Not about the world, not about the gods, not about the forges and the guilds and kingdoms. About broken things. About the right to repair. About where help ends and violence begins. He thought about the old woman with her husband's brooch. He didn't ask the brooch if it wanted to speak again. He just did it, because the old woman asked. But the object didn't ask. He thought about Ha-Rin. He restored his brother's voice to her bow. The bow didn't ask. Ha-Rin didn't ask. He decided on his own, because he believed it was the right thing to do, that it would help, and it did. But did he ask? He thought about Lyra, about the empty pendant. He told the truth. The pendant is empty. Lyra took it off. That was her decision, not his. It was the right thing to do. He didn't try to fix it. He told the truth, and let her decide for herself. There it was. There was the answer. He stood up. Brushed the snow off his knees, looked at the slab, at the warm, gray-black stone that smelled of a thunderstorm, leaned over, placed his palm on it, one last time, and he spoke quietly aloud. He addressed the one lying below, the one who had called to him across worlds, the one who knew how to gather stars and had chosen to scatter himself. He said he could hear him, that he knew who he was, that he understood why he had called, but that he would not put him back together without his consent. He would not repair the one who had chosen to break. Because a restorer is not the creator. A restorer does not decide whether an object should live or not. A restorer asks and waits for an answer. He said he would come, every week. He would place his hand on the stone. He would listen. And if one day the voice said it wanted to be put back together, that it was ready, that it chose to live, then Caden will begin. Not before. He withdrew his hand. Silence. Snow. The cawing of crows. Then, quietly, barely perceptibly, the stone beneath his fingers grew slightly warmer, by a fraction of a degree. Caden froze. It wasn't consent. It was gratitude. For having asked. He straightened up. Inhaled the cold air, exhaled a cloud of steam. He looked toward Hallgren beyond the white hills, a small town with gray roofs, smoke from the chimneys. Somewhere out there was his workshop, his workbench, his tools, his people. He headed back, along the trail through the wastelands, past snow-covered piles of metal, past thousands of shards waiting underground, each with its own story, each with its own voice. They were waiting for him at the workshop. Ha-Rin was standing on the roof. She saw him. She nodded. She came down. Lyra opened the door. The workshop smelled of smoke and something hot. She was cooking soup. She'd learned over the past year. Not very well, but she was cooking. Caden walked in. He took off his jacket, hung it on a nail by the door, sat down at the workbench. An object lay on the table, a small box made of darkened wood. The lid was cracked. The hinges were twisted out of place. The lock was broken. A note lay nearby, written in clumsy handwriting. "Please fix this. It's Mom's." No signature. No name. Someone had brought it and left it while he was away. Caden picked up the box. He placed it in the palm of his hand. He closed his eyes. A memory washed over him like a soft warmth. Lavender. Old fabric. Someone's hands that had opened and closed this lid 1,000 times. They'd kept something small and important inside it. A letter, or a ring, or a lock of hair. He opened his eyes. He looked at the box, then at the workbench, at the tools, at the hammer, the vise, and the file, at the jar of glue, at the spool of wire. He looked at Lyra by the fireplace, at Ha-Rin by the door, at Evie's notebook on the shelf, at the charred bow on the wall, at the shard of a sword on the shelf, at his home. Then he said quietly, aloud, not addressing the people, addressing the box, the small, cracked wooden box in his hands. He said, "Show me where it hurts. I'll fix it." And he began to work. Outside, snow was falling, quietly, steadily. It blanketed the wasteland and the city and the workshop on the edge of the dump. It blanketed the roads and the roofs and the sign on the door that told anyone who came close enough, "Orwell, I fix everything." And far beyond the city, at the bottom of a snow-covered pit, a warm stove glowed quietly in the darkness, and it waited, patiently. The way only those who know that a person has finally been found, one who will ask before fixing, can wait.